thanks so much to the organizers. Do I just get rid of this? And in particular to how we understand trust philosophically. I'm glad we have someone else doing this. It's not me.
All right.
I don't know how I
again. Just say
yeah. Okay. Okay.
You say
I thought I said it. Maybe I didn't say okay.
We're good. Okay.
So we want to start it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Okay. So philosophers have long, and not just philosophers, I mean, social scientists too, have long recognized the value of trust for cooperation, for our ability to do things that we couldn't do on our own, because we're limited in various ways. Many of our ends, our goals, we can't achieve completely on our own. And some philosophers argue that the very concept of trust exists because of the human need to cooperate. So they think that the genealogy of trust, its origins lie in a response to this need to cooperate. So what I do in the paper is to try to argue that that picture is sort of incomplete at best, that the story about the genealogy of trust, how it originated, why we have the concept, is more complicated than that picture suggests. And I want to argue that what that concept does is respond not just to a human need for cooperation, but a human need for belonging. And I understand belonging according to the social science of belonging. So what I'm going to, there are three parts to this paper. First, I'm just going to, I'll discuss what it means to give a genealogy of a concept. I'll do that very briefly, and discuss this view, what I call the old genealogy, that describes the trust in terms of this human need for cooperation. Critique that genealogy, argue that ultimately it's incomplete, and then develop this new theory that talks about how the concept responds to the need to belong. Okay, so the first part on trust and cooperation. So just first, what does it mean to give a genealogy of a concept like trust? It's to give an explanation of why we have that concept in the first place. What are the enduring human needs and interests that it answers to? In other words, why is this concept useful to us as the sorts of beings we are as humans that have certain kinds of needs? So the answers in philosophy, and they're really just three philosophers have given genealogies of trust. They all refer, if only indirectly, to this human need for cooperation. So Karen Jones is one of these philosophers. She doesn't refer directly to cooperation, but her theory about the genealogy of trust is really all about cooperation. So she says that humans were social, finite, and reflective. So she highlights these dimensions of human beings, what it is to be human. We're social and finite because of that. We need to extend our agency, as she puts it, by recruiting the agency of others in order to fulfill our ends or shared ends. So our social nature is just that we're dependent on others. We're finite because we can't fulfill the ends that we have or tasks that we need to fulfill on our own. So as she puts it, we need to extend our agency and recruit the agency of others to help us to achieve ends that we have, or perhaps shared ends like living in a safe neighborhood, right? That's not something we can achieve on our own. And she says, because we're reflective sorts of beings, we can respond to others' dependency on us by acting for the very reason that we're being counted on. So because count on other people, we can act for the reason that we're being counted on. We can reflect on the fact that other people are counting on us, and we take that into account in deciding how to act, right? We can respond to that very fact that they are counting on us, okay? So, you know, there's this sort of distinctive way in which we cooperate with one another here as human beings. We cooperate with one another in such a way that we're not just counting on one another, but we're also able to respond to the very fact that we're being counted on, okay? And she says this dual structure of dependency, as she puts it, counting on the other in a domain and counting on them to respond to the fact that we're counting on them, is the heart of trust, okay? So, you know, in giving her genealogy and others who give genealogies, they're trying to ultimately understand what trust is through this method of thinking about why do we have this concept in the first place. And ultimately, she comes up with a theory, what she calls a counting on theory of trust, where when we trust another, we're optimistic that they'll respond to the fact that we're counting on them. And actually that they're competent also to do what we're counting on them to do. Okay. But it's all about, as I put it earlier, this idea of, you know, extending our agency in this way in order to achieve our ends. And so ultimately what we're doing through trusting and what that concept is responding to is this need we have to cooperate with one another. Okay. I want to say in the paper, I go into quite a bit of detail about this counting on theory of trust. And it, you know, it's actually quite a popular theory of trust in the literature now. I think it's really supplanted Annette Byer's theory, the goodwill account of trust. I think more and more philosophers think of trust in the way Jones is thinking about it. I want to say a bit here more about how she's understanding trust and also trustworthiness. So trust involves being optimistic. The other will respond positively to the fact of being counted on. Okay, so they must understand that they're being counted on by us for them to respond positively in this way. And if they're trustworthy, they will then respond positively to that fact, right? They'll take into account they're being counted on. As I asked in this slide, I mean, what could motivate this sort of responsiveness, responding to the very fact of being counted on? Jones's answer is that they have attitudes like goodwill or love toward us. So if they feel goodwill toward us and they know that we're counting on them, that goodwill will motivate them to act in a trustworthy way, right? Other characteristics might do that: conscientiousness, benevolence, you know, depending on the context. So say I'm counting on my physician, right, to give me good health care. If my physician is a conscientious doctor and they do see me as their patient, their conscientiousness will activate that sort of responsiveness that is sort of characteristic of trust. Okay, as long as they have that conscientiousness, they will act on the very fact that they're being counted on by me. Okay, so trustworthiness then, it involves having these kinds of attitudes or characteristics. It involves being motivated in a certain way. And most philosophers do talk about trustworthiness in this sort of way, in terms of what motivates the trustworthy person. And only certain kinds of motives will do on most accounts. So if someone is motivated to do what you're counting on them to do out of self-interest or out of fear or out of hatred, right? They might be reliable for you, but they're not trustworthy, according to most philosophers, okay? She has a distinctive account, this account of trust and trustworthiness, but what's not distinctive is this idea of saying that with trustworthiness, there's certain kinds of motives that we expect of the other, whereas reliance and reliability are different. So I'm going to come back to that, and I just wanted to highlight that about her account. Okay, so just to summarize that first bit, you know, I'm using Jones as a representative example of the old genealogy, but generally what those theories say is that trust along with trustworthiness capture the distinctive way humans interact so that they can cooperate with one another effectively. So what these concepts do, that therefore is answer to our need to cooperate, okay? So my critique, I have 3 criticisms of that view of trust. One is that I think there can be trust without cooperation. I think that old genealogy suggests that all trust serves our need to cooperate, but some trust I think occurs just for the sake of making new social connections with others. So I give an example in the paper of a new immigrant to a country who doesn't know people there, and they, strike up a conversation with a stranger just because they're feeling, adrift, not feeling grounded, and they just want to make a social connection, right? They're not striving to cooperate, at least not in Jones's sense of extending their agency by recruiting the agency of others to fulfill certain tasks they want to fulfill. They're simply trying to feel more grounded and have social connection with another. Rather than interpreting that in terms of extending our agency, I interpret it in terms of shoring up our agency, right? Through trust, we're trying to ensure that there is a kind of stable I person who can then cooperate with others, right? So some trust serves that need of shoring up agency rather than extending it. Okay, my other criticism of the old genealogy is that it can explain what we might lose if we got most of the cooperation we need without trusting, okay? So what if we could just satisfy our need to cooperate without trust at all, with just reliance, for example? So I give a couple scenarios in the paper. I'm just going to talk about one here, which involves people relying on advanced AI to achieve much of what they can achieve on their own. And imagine AI here that's advanced enough that it could do that for us, right? Help us to achieve what we can achieve on our own, but not advanced enough to be trustworthy. To have those kinds of attitudes I referred to earlier, or characteristics like integrity, conscientiousness, love, goodwill. People are striving to create AI right now that can have some of those attitudes, but just imagine it's not AI like that, okay? So we have reliance, we're relying on AI here, right? We're achieving, the goals that we have, we can achieve on our own. We're satisfying our need to cooperate, but we're not trusting, or there's very minimal trust in our lives. So I don't think the old genealogy can explain why there might be some kind of loss here. And I do think there is loss. I think we would feel disconnected and isolated from people around us if that's how we were living our lives, okay? And that suggests that trust does something more for us than just satisfying our need to cooperate. Okay. One last criticism of the old genealogy. I don't think it can really accurately describe the vulnerability to betrayal that goes along with trust. So somewhat famously among philosophers, Annette Byers said that trust, I'm not going to get this right, it can't merely be disappointed. I'm not getting it. But it can be betrayed, or at least let down, okay? So trust is different from reliance. If you rely on another, merely rely on them and not trust them. You could be disappointed if they don't do what you're relying on them to do, but you won't feel betrayal, okay? Trust is distinctive because it involves a special vulnerability to betrayal. So that's true of most trust. I don't think it's true of all trust. It's complicated, but I think that's one way in which philosophers have distinguished trust from reliance. Philosophers have surprisingly said very little about betrayal, but the accounts that are out there tend to associate it with feeling rejected or abandoned. And that is when people break our trust for no good reason, that's when betrayal is appropriate. And what they experience when that happens is rejection or abandonment. I think that sort of reaction to broken trust is too strong if our concern in trusting in the first place was merely instrumental in getting others to cooperate with us. I think if that was our concern in the first place, we'd feel frustrated, for sure, maybe disappointed if they didn't help us to achieve our ends that we can't achieve on our own. But I'm not sure we would feel abandoned or rejected. I could be wrong about that. So those are my criticisms of the old genealogy that, compels me to try to develop a new theory, a new genealogy where I argue that trust responds not just to that need to cooperate, but the need to belong. And I understand that need to belong according to the science of belonging that exists in psychology mostly. Okay. And what I do here is rely quite a bit on the work of Baumeister and Leary. So they're considered foundational pioneers in belonging research. They published this paper in 1995, and the picture there on the slide is just the title of that paper. It's been cited well over 20,000 times. It's very influential, so I rely on that in the paper. I also rely on a recent interview done with Baumeister and Leary by some other belonging experts. It was published in 2022. And they say in that interview that they basically stand by what they said in that 1995 paper with a few exceptions. So I refer to both of those sources. Those are my main sources in the paper. So what do Baumeister and Leary say about the need to belong? So they say it is characterized by a pervasive drive to form stable relationships of mutual concern in which people feel a sense of acceptance. Okay. So they're saying it is a pervasive drive, it's a universal drive, it exists among all humans, and they review a ton of literature when they're making this claim. And I just elaborate here on the slide about what that belonging requires. It does require frequent contact with the other person or group. So importantly on their theory, and they clarify this in the 2022 interview, you can have this sense of a belonging in an intimate relationship or a interpersonal relationship, but you can also have it with a group. Okay. So but you have to have frequent contact with those people from whom, or that group from whom you get the sense of belonging. And there has to be a perception of there being a bond of affective concern. So there's some kind of affection, level of affection that's mutual within that relationship. And you need not many of these connections, but they say just a minimum quantity. So enough to stave off the pathology that you would experience if you were connected to no one or to no group. So those of you who are familiar with the science of loneliness, that literature is relevant here too in describing the kinds of negative health effects that happen from being disconnected with other human beings. Okay. So they argue that the impact of this need is enormous, actually. And that's true, even though the need doesn't require that we have that kind of relationship with most people. We only need a minimum quantity of these relationships. They say at a certain point, the need is just satiated and more relationships don't do us any good. But why then is the impact enormous if we only need a minimum quantity of these relationships? They say that the need causes us to be concerned about what they call our relational value. So how worthy we are of acceptance by other people, right? And that can be called into question by rejection that we experience even by strangers. Even with strangers where we're not trying to develop one of those close relationships, there's no prospect of that. So it's sort of a one-off interaction with the stranger. The empirical research suggests that rejection, even in those kinds of situations, can cause us to feel a loss of relational value or perceived relational value, right? And worry that, that other more sort of important people might reject us in the future. Okay. So this concern about relational value, it shapes also our experiences of discrimination, prejudice, stigmatization. So if we're stigmatized, say, by dominant patriarchal, views about beauty, right, we're gonna if we're truly stigmatized by that, our perceived relational value will decrease. Okay. So with this new genealogy, what I do is argue that the concept of trust responds to that need as they understand it, not just our need to cooperation. It describes an important way in which we create and maintain a sense of belonging, along with our perception of ourselves as having relational value. So I argue that trust serves that need, and that's especially true when it's met with trustworthiness. Okay, and I just interpret those concepts as Jones does. So through trust and trustworthiness, that's how we create and sustain these relationships of belonging that Baumeister and Leary talk about. Those relationships of effective concern, of acceptance. They exist, right, only with trust and trustworthiness. And particularly relevant here is trustworthiness that's motivated by affection, by motives like love, like goodwill. But even trustworthiness that's motivated by something a little more abstract or less sort of personal, like moral commitment or conscientiousness, right? That can serve our need to belong because it bolsters this perception we have of having relational value. Okay. So trust and trustworthiness together allow us to have those kinds of relationships we need in order to have a sense of belonging. And it allows us to sustain a perception of ourselves as having relational value, being worthy of acceptance. So I just explained, I'm going to stop. I just explained in this slide how, basically that theory fills the gaps that I identified in the old genealogy. I won't go over this, but those problems we saw in the old genealogy, I don't think they exist for the new theory, because the need to belong explains, for example, how we can have trust without cooperation. I won't go over that. So just to summarize this, I argue we have a psychological need to belong. It helps to explain why we have the concept of trust. That old genealogy is flawed, and we should embrace a new genealogy that ties the concept to the need to belong and the need to cooperate. I think that need is important too in this context. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We'll take questions now, if anyone has any. Okay.
Thanks. So if I get you right, you're suggesting that we get from trust to a sense of belonging. So trust is kind of a precondition for getting a sense of belonging. By the way, I totally accept your picture that trust serves other purposes than cooperation, and that belonging is one of them. So I guess in quite a lot of the social science work on this, people kind of often assume the opposite relation between trust and belonging, that belonging gets us to trust, right? Yeah. So insofar as I identify with other people, feel that we belong to the same group, that will enable me or increase my ability to trust other people within the group, and that may get us other things as well, cooperation, for instance, but also solidarity and so on. So that's kind of assumes the opposite relation in a way. Do you have any comments to that?
Yeah. Sure. I meant to mention that at the beginning is, I'm obviously flipping that on its head. And I think it's probably more of a kind of bilateral, if that's the right word, bidirectional thing there. But, what I am suggesting is that you can have trust without belonging in the first place. And that makes sense, I think, on Karen Jones's theory, because all that's needed for trust is this optimism that the other will be responsive to the fact that I'm counting on them. And you might be optimistic about that. Like imagine my, story of the immigrant. They come across some stranger, why do they strike up a conversation with the stranger? What makes them sort of optimistic enough about the stranger to do that? They might just sense that the stranger is empathetic, right? that they recognize that, you know, they can see just maybe my body language that I'm feeling adrift, I'm feeling lonely, right? And they just have this sort of, as human beings do, I think, natural kind of empathy toward others. And that would be enough, right? So I'm worried about these views that suggest that you need to belong, you know, in order to feel trust, or I don't know if the view is that it's in order to be trusted to. I guess it is, right? You need, you know, others need to see that you belong in order for them to trust you as well. Yeah. And you know, I think there may be some truth to that, but you know, I worry about that because then you know, outsiders are never going to make their way in. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's right, but I think it's important to recognize that the direction could go the other way. You know, especially if we conceive of belonging or attachment. I talk about attachment in the paper. And the way social psychologists talk about that is in terms of having certain kinds of relationships. And those relationships can only get off the ground and can only be sustained over time through trust, I think. So trust has to work to foster that belonging. It can't just be the other way.
Before we go with more questions here, we'll let Patty ask her question.
Hi, Patty.
Hi, Carolyn. Hi, everybody. That talk was great. I really learned from it, actually, and I have taken pictures of all your slides. So thank you. And I'd be delighted to read the full paper. I don't know if it's available, but if you want more comments, I would be delighted to do that. I just have a teeny question about reason number 2, or B, I guess you called it B, with respect to why the trust and cooperation story can't be the right one. And actually, this is maybe this question is just, what's your other example in the paper? Because I didn't find the AI example to be great. I mean, it's weird, which I could explain why, but what I would just say, I mean, I have lots of reasons, but I guess lots of people cooperate without trusting. That would have been my response, right? Which is just, I mean, trust is a particular attitude that you take, and if you shape the conditions correctly, then people will cooperate under all kinds of conditions without extending trust. And you could describe that among ethnic groups or among just people who are trying to get a job done.
Cutting in and out, Patty.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know is that me? I don't know. I can type my question if that's helpful. Is that better?
I think I'm getting the gist of it. If you want to.
Okay.
Keep going.
Yeah, so it's just the thought that the example just could be that people cooperate in all kinds of places without trust. Institutions can shape an opportunity for people to trust in all kinds of ways. I mean, institutions can shape it so that people can cooperate without trust in all kinds of ways. I would thought.
Yeah, I think that may be true. I mean, I think sometimes there's trust without our really recognizing it. So, you know, there may be trust in the institutions themselves, and that's what allows for the cooperation that you're talking about. But, you know, I take your point. That may be true, but the theory says that what trust does is answer to this need to cooperate. Maybe, yeah. But let me just give you the other example I use, which is just, I talk about socially dominant individuals who, in a society structured, you know, by inequality, who are able to cooperate with those who have less social power, just by relying on their fear or their self-interest. So you might, you know, employ them and, you know, even give them low wages, but they really have no other opportunity but to accept those wages. And so it's in their self-interest to cooperate with you. You know, there's relationships of reliance, but they're not trust. So you could imagine a socially dominant person who lives their lives mostly with these sorts of relationships with others and not many other relationships. They're satisfying a need to cooperate, but there's something missing. They're losing out by not trusting other people. That's my other example. But I'd love to hear what your concerns are about the AI example, for sure. I don't know whether we have time for that now, but
I will let others speak since the connection isn't great, but I will happily send you an email, Carolyn.
thanks.
Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed the paper. I really liked it. I had a version of the bidirectionality question, but so maybe which you responded to, but then your response actually raised the another question, which is to do with the immigrant example, because I think so I take it, or my intuition is that trust involves putting yourself in a situation of vulnerability vis-a-vis someone else and having this optimistic attitude. But the way in which you describe that case, like I'm standing on a corner and I speak to somebody else, that just seems like social interaction with a stranger. It doesn't seem like it has the kind of an attitude of trust because there isn't vulnerability. I mean, so a stranger might actually not, I think there's hardly any, I don't see that there's a strong element of trust there. I think for that example to work, you need to explain what it is that you need to have a social interaction in which the person renders themselves vulnerable for there to be trust. I just couldn't see it in that case. And I think you needed it in order to explain the directionality of trust and belonging. So maybe I just wanted to invite you to like maybe even think of another example or persuade me that that example works, because I had a different intuition about that example.
Okay. So I do think the example works. I don't think, just any interaction with a stranger necessarily involves that vulnerability. So if I'm just walking down the street and I'm trying to figure out when bus 71 is going to arrive, and I pick my first stranger and say, can you tell me, when it's arriving, if that person doesn't know, I'll just move on to the next. I'm not really making myself vulnerable with them. But in this case, this person is feeling, they're not feeling grounded. They're feeling sort of adrift. They're feeling lost. And they're reaching out to this stranger in the hopes of developing some kind of social connection, even if only, somewhat fleeting. At least they may get a sense from that stranger that, they matter to them and, they matter to other people in this new country that they're living in. So I do think there's vulnerability there in that example. They're vulnerable to rejection by the stranger, which is.
Maybe you need a mutuality there, right? Like, so in your description, you have person being vulnerable and then recognizing that the other person respond in a certain way. I mean, you might not know what feeling.
Yeah.
I'll take that as given, but I think we need to flesh out that the other.
Sure.
Doesn't the other person have to have some kind of, for it to be a trust?
So the other person, to be trustworthy on Joan's account, has to respond to that act of being counted on. And they have to understand, they have to understand how they're being counted on. And that might not happen in the example, right? The stranger might not understand that. In which case the trust, it may be broken, it may be misplaced, there's something wrong, something bad happens there. But that doesn't mean there isn't vulnerability in the first place. There may still be vulnerability, right? Because the person just doesn't get the response that they're looking for. Yeah. Well, they could betray. It's possible, but not all responses to trust involve betrayal. Like yeah. Yeah.
So I just have a sort of clarification question. I'm pretty sure I didn't understand something, but so I hear that you're saying that trust and trustworthiness are necessary for belonging. So and I think, and I think I heard, though this just might be me, that trust and trustworthiness takes a lot of sort of cognitive work and reflexivity and thought. And so if that's a requirement for belonging, then what about people who are cognitively deficient in some way or haven't developed cognitively? I mean, does that mean that those people then they never belong? They never have that, because it almost seems like, when I think of belonging, I think of sort of a feeling. Whereas when I think of trust, I think of sort of, thought. And so I'm just wondering how these are connected and maybe they're not relevant at all, but that's my question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have to think more about that. I mean, I think, the person who, has some cognitive challenges may not be able to respond to the fact that others are counting on them in every kinds of domain, especially if that counting on is quite complicated. But, they could still trust others to respond to the fact that they are counting on them. And that in itself would, breed this sense of belonging. But let me just say, I mean, in the paper, mainly for simplicity, I sort of go with Jones's view about what trust and trustworthiness are. So she calls it a counting on view. Others call it a trust responsive account. I am critical of that view of trust, that the literature, there's no real agreement. I do think that view of trust is dominant now, but it's, I don't entirely buy it. So my Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on trust, I describe, what criticisms you might give of that kind of theory. I kind of run with it in this paper, but maybe I need to be a little more critical of it because I don't think that trust is as sort of, maybe the simplest way to put it is as cognitive as maybe that theory suggests. I think trust is an effective attitude. It's anyway. So I think I take your point, and I think maybe I need to think a little more about what theory of trust I kind of rely on in this paper. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Just before the next question, we only have 10 minutes left in question period and quite a few people. So if we could get the question from Nicholas and Keith, and then if you could answer those two, and we'll move on after that.
I really like this paper. I suppose my question, I have a number of questions, but this question is more clarificatory. Like, are you saying that, so you seem to say cooperation is important, but it's neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for trust.
Sorry, which is important? Did you? Sorry.
So you say at the end, it's belonging and cooperation that's important, right? But then in your argument, you say cooperation is neither necessary nor sufficient, right? Like you have trust without cooperation, and then you have cooperation without trust. Yeah. Would you have the same for belonging? So can you have trust without belonging and belonging without trust?
Not sure I'd say you can have trust without belonging, because I think the belonging bit, well, maybe not all trust. So this is like, I'm not, so I'm not talking about necessary and sufficient conditions here. Like I do think understanding trust in terms of the need to cooperate is important, not to understand all trust, but certainly a lot of it. And, I probably would say the same thing about the need to belong. And that's mainly because it explains that vulnerability to betrayal. There is some trust that doesn't make us vulnerable to betrayal. So an example is what philosophers call therapeutic trust, where you're trusting another in order to try to encourage them to become more morally responsible. So if I trust my, my youngest is now 13, I can't use my own kids anymore. If I trust, imagine my youngest was, 7, I trust him to go to the store, I give him some money to get some milk and come home. And I'm trying to sort of engender a sense of responsibility in him. And I don't think my trust can be betrayed, because I'm not really that optimistic that he's going to come through, but I'm just testing it out. You know what I mean? So that's an example of trust where there's no vulnerability to betrayal. Anyway, sorry.
Like I suppose I'm putting what I think is your answer to the question I haven't asked, which my question was like, look at your doctor example. There's a trust. I trust my doctor, but I don't have a sense of belonging with respect to my doctor.
Yep.
Right. I don't feel like this is a professional, and so insofar as trust is suffused in a range of different more transactional and professional relationships. Belonging seems out of place. And I assumed that your answer to me was like, no, these are cooperation-based trust relationships, as opposed to a whole other set, which are belonging-based relationships. And then in the middle of the Venn diagram are cooperation and belonging-based relationships.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm not going to answer because I'm not supposed to. Keith has.
I found this fascinating, and it's not a conversation I've been part of. But the empiricist in me has to ask the question. So I apologize. Is it relevant to your conception of the origins of trust that trust levels vary across countries? And they vary across countries not because of the need for cooperation or the sorts of variables you've been talking about, but with a whole set of other things like the religion, dominant religion in that society and economic development, that a set of social and economic factors which seem to explain variation in trust levels across countries. So how do you think about that in relation to your conceptual formation?
So I think you'd have to explain that. Like a philosopher would have to explain that, given the way they tend to understand trust and trustworthiness, by saying that these social or cultural factors, they themselves explain why we can be optimistic that others will have attitudes like goodwill, love, conscientiousness, integrity, the sorts of things that can motivate trustworthiness, that those factors would have some impact on whether when we're depending on others, we can depend on them to act, perhaps directly in response to that dependence or whatever, with those kinds of attitudes, with those kinds of motivations. Do you see what I mean? So I think I could explain it with the kind of account I've described here. Just to Nicholas's question about the trust with the doctor, I do think belonging is relevant there, and this is where that concept of relational value comes in. So with it is a belonging based relationship if what that means is that the need to belong can explain the reaction you might have or you would have if your doctor betrays you. The betrayal there would make you feel rejected, abandoned, right? Because you have this need to belong, and the need to belong encourages us to have those sorts of reactions because we care about our relational value, right? And that perceived relational value of ours decreases when that kind of thing happens. Maybe not with every trust relationship, but probably in particular with doctors, if we hold them to some esteem, which maybe many people don't do anymore. But do you see what I mean? So this is where that idea of relational value comes in, right? If belonging was only relevant to those relationships that Baumeister and Leary say we need to have in order to, not suffer, then it's not going to explain very much trust, because we only need a small number of those relationships, right? But the need to belong is relevant beyond them because it explains the kind of reaction we have when others reject us, even people that we don't particularly care a lot about or don't have those kinds of rich relationships with. That's what the empirical, I'm going to say, that's what the facts say.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. So I had two reactions, and it'll be a question. So I didn't quite catch why the conversational example was so devastating for the account about counting on, because of course conversations themselves are pretty highly orchestrated events, right? We can talk about norms of cooperation that need to be implicit in having a conversation with somebody, Gricean maxims or whatever you want to cash that out, right? I have to have a certain kind of turn taking. We have to have a certain kind of conversational etiquette, which is to say that one could gin up on the counted on approach, a pretty easy explanation about what's going on there. So I didn't
Are you
quite feel
thinking
the,
about the immigrant example?
yeah, so I didn't quite
versus-
feel the force of that as devastating for that view. But so maybe that's just a report. The second more substantive question is about this idea of relational value. Because I'm thinking of instances where I don't trust somebody, say a child or a friend, to perform some specific task. And I'm open about it. I say, yeah, I don't trust you to do this. But in reporting that to this person, they don't feel any relational wrong or diminishment or devalued in any way. In fact, they're like, yeah, don't trust me to do that.
Sure.
And so I just don't feel the pull of that on the distrust. There could be instances of warranted distrust that don't
Yeah.
diminish relational value. Seems.
So I haven't thought enough about distrust here, and I need to think more about that. But what I'm thinking where the relational value piece comes in is when you do decide to trust someone, right? So you are vulnerable to them. You've put yourself in a position of vulnerability to them, and they act badly. They don't act as they're being counted on to act, which suggests that I mean, if it's true betrayal there, it's like you don't matter enough to them to act as they're counting on you to act. So that's where the rejection comes in. I totally agree with you. I might just, say to you, I'm not going to trust, like say to my mother, I'm not going to trust you to, tell me anything about philosophy. And she'd be like, go ahead. Of course. Why would you do that in the first place? Right. So that's not where that rejection comes in. There has to be this act of trusting. Yeah. But maybe I need to think more about, back to your first point, I need to think more about this. What kind of example do I need in order to explain why, some people might trust without any interest in cooperating. They're really trusting to create relationships. And I'm relying a lot in the paper there about this notion that Jones uses about extending your agency. I'm trying to extend my agency. I mean, that when I read that paper, that just, this is what I reacted to the most is we're not always trying to extend our agency by trusting other people, right? Sometimes it's really about, as I put it, it's like kind of shoring up our agency. We're trying to develop a kind of connection with them that we need in order to not feel lost, not feel disconnected.
So we've run a bit over time, but we still have 2 questions. So if we could take the questions and then maybe Carolyn would be so nice to respond to you later.
Thank you. I really like to support the idea actually. And the only thing is that, don't you think that belonging actually comes first? Because for me, belonging is actually an emotional space, right? This is a group of people. This is the space of a room. This is a special kind of setting where I feel safe. Because I feel safe, I trust the ecology, right? So, but then it comes in the notion of obligation there, because trust means that there's an exchange, there is investment, or in your word is shoring up your agency. So there's obligation there. I have to trust the other people. I obliged to in the situation that I believe the other person's capacity, and the other person, because is being trusted by me, is obliged to respond to that. That actually betrays or denies the idea of belonging, because belonging is supposed to be free, right? It's where you're supposed to be safe. So I think there's a contradiction over there, even though it's really nice to connect trust and belonging, but I don't know, a lot of contradiction that I see that. How can we answer this? Thanks.
Thank you. Just very interesting. I just want to highlight in trust research, the 2 very distinct conceptualization of trust. One is simply trust is a world view. They are simply trust. Another is like your take is more rational calculation. Trust is a rational choice. I trust because I want to be like have higher sense of belonging. And that related a lot of research on taking that approach, thinking about how trust linked to intelligence. For example, smart people are more trusting. A lot of research showing higher IQ associated with trust. And then also thinking about like how trust kind of like motivated. Yes, like you mentioned, like I want to, like people who want to get the benefits of trusting, and then they balance between risk and then trust, because trust can be very risky. So the people who can balance between risk and trust, and then if, for example, people who are more powerful to take on risk, they are more likely to trust. And then people who are less powerful to take on risk, then they're less trusting. So that's also related, for example, intelligence, risk, and then risk taking. And then maybe people who are motivated to belong and getting benefits from belong to a certain group, then they're more trusting.
Thank you all for your questions. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you. It's a mystery. Probably possible.
Do it another time. Yeah, I already shared it.
You shared it because I wasn't sure that was
Yeah,
yours.
Okay, next up, we have Matthew Clark from the University of Leeds with his presentation, You Have to Trust Me, Self-Belief, Trust, and Fairness.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? I kind of feel like a garage band that's been booked after Metallica or something. I don't think this is going to be as informative as Caroline's was, but I hope that you will enjoy it. The paper is entitled You Have to Trust Me, Self-Belief, Trust, and Fairness. I called it that, and I was quite happy with You Have to Trust Me, because I used to argue in this paper that we had duties to trust. And I was like, oh, that's nice. It's the thing people actually say. I no longer argue that. So that bit is irrelevant. And also in this talk, I'm not going to really talk about trust. I'm going to talk about distrust. So self-belief, distrust, and fairness. So I'm going to start with a poem. It's this from the epigram to a book called No Beast So Fierce. It's from a poem by William Bacon. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Reason I start with this, I think it's quite useful to get kind of a vivid image of the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about today. So what I'm going to be arguing is that kind of distrust, when it happens in systematic, pervasive ways, puts limits on the kind of things we can do, the kind of agency that the distrusted person has. So we talk quite a lot about what it feels like to distrust. This is more focusing on what it's like to be distrusted. And to put that in kind of those poetic terms, that's to say that pervasive and systematic distrust can kind of forge these manacles of the mind, right? So to give a little bit more detail, I'm going to try to talk about the effects that systematic and pervasive distrust can have on our agency. I'm not the first person to notice these kind of effects, so I'm going to be trying to draw attention to some specific mechanisms by which I think distrust can impact what we can do. I'm going to argue that being distrusted places certain different types of limits on us. In the paper, I argue more heavily that this is kind of unjust, that it happens in many societies. I link it up with kind of integration of ex-offenders and questions around that. And I suggest some ways it ought to be stopped. I'm probably not going to be able to go into too much detail on any of that, but if you have any questions, let me know. So just to give you kind of a brief outline, there's kind of 4 parts. I'm going to rush through 1 and 4 and probably 2, and spend a little bit longer on 3. So unjust limits on agents. So I'm going to argue that distrust produces limits on agency. Why is that a problem? Well, kind of in the paper, I expand quite a bit on kind of capabilities views, right? This ability to practically reason is viewed as something that's essential for people to have, the ability to kind of deliberate, decide what you want to do. But I think we can take something a little bit more general. So I think that we can think that a society ought to allow its members to live their own lives in some way, that an important ability that you need to do that is some ability to direct that life, to make the choices that you want to do, plan and do the things that you want to do. So that's kind of why I'm thinking that this is unjust. So to just kind of go through some definitions on, so I'm talking about distrust, not so much at an interpersonal level. I do think where there are major power imbalances, that kind of distrust can have similar effects. But I'm talking about distrust when it's more systematic. So what do I mean by distrust? I'm trying to remain relatively open between different accounts of distrust, at least philosophical accounts. I'm afraid I don't know very many others. What I kind of want to draw attention to are 2 things that I think are partially common to those accounts. The second one maybe less so. One of these is that distrust leads to certain kind of behaviors, certain kinds of actions that are typical. I call these in the paper withdrawal and monitoring. So withdrawal is the idea that when you distrust someone, you kind of try to avoid them, try to kind of remove yourself from them. And what I call monitoring, I'm thinking actually the word managing captures slightly better what I mean. So this is kind of to try to kind of direct their action when you can't avoid interaction with them because of distrust. And I think that for distrust acceptable, we generally want a ground for our suspicion, right? And that often what that has to be is some kind of evidence, right? So I do think that we talk about, oh, I distrust them because I just have this feeling. I think they creep me out a little bit. But I think we generally think that that's an unacceptable kind of form of distrust to have. And the things that we often appeal to in those situations would be some openly available evidence. Pervasive distrust is fairly clear. It means that the attitude is just widespread among some population. I mean that it's become more formalized or institutionalized. Now, I'm not just talking about kind of society as a group. I think this also applies to kind of organizations, institutions. And when I say systematic, I don't mean purely that it's kind of informal policies or laws. And it can also be kind of incorporated into the culture of the group, right? So this develops where you get pervasive and or systematic distrust. I think that you kind of can develop systems of distrust. What I want to kind of argue is that we, at a social level, these behavioral tendencies that we find as in interpersonal distrust get replicated at a higher level, right? So in place of withdrawal, we often have exclusion, so kind of bars what people can do. And in place of kind of this monitoring, managing, we often have extensive supervision or surveillance. Kind of the prison, the ex-offender system, which is kind of where a lot of my thinking about this has come from, is kind of an obvious version of that. There are bars on certain kinds of jobs you can take, and there are like a lot of various ways in which you are closely monitored after you leave prison. These kinds of trusts, I think, can come about in a couple of ways. They're often stereotypical and prejudiced, right? So it's specifically pervasive and systematic distrust when those prejudices and stereotypes revolve around an image of a member of that group as untrustworthy. So a very prominent, pervasive and kind of ridiculously socially acceptable example of this is the Gypsy and Traveller community in the UK, who tend to be viewed as practically untrustworthy. But I think you can also get cases of warranted distrust, right? So you arguably get this in the case of ex-offenders, at least some of the time. And you also get this in the case, perhaps, of some work situations, right? Poor productivity, things like that. And warranted distrust means I think that you have some good reason. And stereotypical and prejudiced distrust and its effects on agency has obviously had a lot more action in the literature, including things about like interpretation, the effect of stigma, all of these things. What I'm saying here is meant to be supplemental to that. I agree with all of that. I think one of the advantages of what I'm talking about now, or we'll go on to talk about, is that it also covers cases where that distrust is maybe merited in some way in the distrusted people. So to try to link it to agency, first of all, I'm going to, again, I'm afraid, do a little bit of like groundskeeping, but then I will get on to the rest of it. So it's common in philosophy to think that our actions are somehow bounded by our beliefs, both about the world, right, and about what we can do to a certain extent. And so when we make intentions, when we think about what we want to do, when we make plans, we should respond, kind of make sure that these match how the world actually is and the beliefs that we hold about the world, at least to some degree, and we kind of have rational constraints to do that. This is in mainly because when I've talked about this before in front of philosophers, they've got angry about what kind of can I mean, so ignore this if you don't care, but like to disambiguate, I'm not talking about like an absolute sense of can, which I think philosophers often talk about, what you have the ability to do, right? So I can climb Ben Nevis. Ben Nevis is the highest mountain in the UK. I have the ability to climb Ben Nevis, like means that I can do it in some absolute sense. There may be things that stop me from doing it, but that doesn't get rid of the ability, right? That's not so much what my interest is. I'm talking about can in the sense of effectiveness. And for those of you who may be familiar with social psychology literature, there's a sense of self-efficacy, which Albert Bandura talks about. I'm not kind of fully borrowing that, but I'm indebted to kind of some of the ways that that is conceptualized. And this is more about what you can effectively do. It's a more probabilistic thing. It's about what you actually think you'll have success in bringing about. And so, for example, I can climb Ben Nevis in fine weather, and you can see how those two come apart, right? My uncle is a mountain rescuer. He can climb Ben Nevis whenever he likes. I can only climb Ben Nevis in the summer, but we maybe have the same absolute ability to climb Ben Nevis in some sense, even if his is more robust. We then have this sense of what we can do, right? So when I'm talking about what we can do in these ways, we have various ways that we think and conceptualize what we can do. Our interpretation is part of this, but also like a complex set of emotions get involved: confidence, hope, despair, self-esteem, and a lot of these have been considered in relationships to trust and distrust. But I think there's also this evidence responsive part of this. We have these kind of self-directed beliefs, and these are our self-beliefs, right? Kind of beliefs in the form of like, I believe I can climb Ben Nevis in fine weather. And the effectiveness beliefs matter because they're an important part of how we reason practically, right? What we actually think we can do helps determine what kind of agents we can be, what kind of things we can set out and try. And the reason I think that is so important, and this is again kind of to argue against what's quite a philosophical view of maybe how it's rational to plan, but to social scientists, I imagine will seem fine, which is that the kind of agents that we are can only do a certain number of things, right? We face limitations, what I'm calling effort here. So we have limited reserves of things like willpower, of the ability to control our emotions, sustain motivation, things like that. And so our effectiveness can be limited by these kind of things, by this, the capacity that we have to keep that effort maintained and to keep it going. And so it's important, if you're a well-functioning practical agent, to be aware of the range of things that you can actually do, not just the range of things that you could kind of practically do. And I think this is particularly important where difficulties are faced doing something successfully, right? And those difficulties can either be internal, so for example, when we suffer from addiction, or they can be external in that they can be caused by barriers. And now to get back to distrust. So I think distrust matters because distrust, because it has these behavioral tendencies, right, it creates difficulties for people who want to act in certain ways. So both interpersonally and systematically, distrust can create these difficulties. So as I said, these can be withdrawal, they can be monitoring, and being distrusted makes any kind of action that's going to involve some other people more difficult. To give a little example of this that's at least interpersonal, right? Why do these barriers matter? Well, they require us to sustain greater effort, right? And so in doing so, they can limit the kind of things that we can do. And so you can think about just a simple case where you say distrust your friend to borrow a book, but maybe it's a book she really needs for some reason. So you may withdraw, you might avoid situations where she can ask you for the book, or you might kind of try to stipulate loads of ways, loads of things she has to do. You can't read it at the beach, you can't take it in the bathroom, you're not allowed to drink it, like drink coffee near it. You might put all of these things that are going to complicate the situation for her. So she might have to keep this willpower going in ways she otherwise wouldn't have to. And she may also find it difficult to keep kind of how much do I really need this book, given the difficulties that I'm facing. And so because of effort being limited, the greater effort that we have, the lower the effectiveness that we have. And what I think this ends up doing is having an impact on kind of what we can like practically think about doing, what we can actually plan on doing. And so it goes on to have a broader impact on our agency, right? And the way it does this is it creates a kind of cycle. So the more difficulties you face and in the wider range of places, the more effort you have to use to do all of the individual things that you have to do. And so you fail at more things than you otherwise would, right? And that provides evidence and feedback to your self-belief. When you update those self-beliefs, you kind of go, oh, well, actually, I can't do that. And you have good reason to think that you can't do that. You've just failed to do it. And then when you're coming to plan again, you have to kind of adapt to those beliefs. And you're going to need to replan more often because failure gives you a rational reason to want to replan. But I also think, and this is important, I think, when you flip and turn to trust, that distrust also limits self-belief, right? And the reason for this is that distrust is, I think, a source of social feedback to us, right? We turn to trust and distrust to work out what we can do. We partially have to do this, and I think the empirical evidence backs this up, but there's also lots of philosophical work on the kind of biases that we face when we think about what we're capable of doing, that we're really bad calibrators of what we can do, right? We face all kinds of issues with that. And I think when someone distrusts us, we take it anyway as a judgment that we will not act in the distrusted ways. When my friends trust me with a book, I take that to mean that they think I can't care for the book in the appropriate way, that I won't behave in the way that I ought to behave with the book. And I think, as I mentioned, that where distrust is acceptable, we often think that there's an evidence base for this. So where distrust has become systematic, where it's often we confuse things that are widespread for things that are acceptable, these effects are likely to be exacerbated, and we're likely to get much stronger social feedback and potentially quite far-reaching social feedback. And so we take others' distrust in us as evidence about what we're actually capable of doing, right? And this feeds into our self-beliefs, feeds into the set of things that we actually take ourselves to be able to do. And so it produces limits on the kind of intentions and plans that we can form, the ways that we can act. So I've tried to show there that being distrusted, kind of how I think it forms psychological limitations. Sorry that that's been like at quite a peg, but I do hopefully have time, yeah, to go through a bit of the stuff about like what I think we should do about this. So I think, first of all, just to answer like an objection you might be thinking in the case of warranted distrust, well, isn't that reasonable? Like, you know, people who are going to cause us harm, aren't they the exact kind of people we should be distrusting? Isn't trusting partially about protecting us from vulnerabilities that we might face, right? Well, I think obviously in cases of kind of stereotypical or prejudicial distrust, it's not a reasonable response to have. And I argue a bit more fully in the paper, and if people want to push me on this, I'd be happy to be pushed because I'm not 100% happy with it. But I think in cases of warranted distrust, that the effects that you actually have, the kind of limitations where this is truly systematic and pervasive in a society, right, can be too detrimental to justify that unless there's a very high risk of situations. So potentially, for example, so because I consider ex-offenders in the paper, I do consider kind of, where there's a risk to life or a kind of similarly high risk than that. Perhaps some of these kind of restrictions are justified in that way, but outside of those kind of situations, they're hard to justify. And I think even given kind of standard retributive views of punishment, they might be hard to justify in all cases. So I think what we ought to do and how we ought to respond to this is that we should think about resisting distrust, right? So I think as a society, we have a duty perhaps to try to dismantle some of these pervasive and systematic kinds of distrust. And so I think where we reinforce those kind of systems as individuals and as a society, we can end up wronging the distrusted person. And so we ought, I think, each of us to attempt to deconstruct those prejudices and stereotypes. This is a fairly common kind of response to stereotypical issues, right? And that may include us doing further evidence gathering, but I think our response is going to go two ways. Because I also think that in cases of warranted distrust, we may actually have to end the kind of inquiry or evidence gathering that we're doing. We should attempt to not give ourselves reasons to distrust in those situations, right? So for example, when you're dealing with an ex-offender, you may find out that they are an ex-offender somehow, but you should resist from allowing that to develop more fully into distrust. Now, do we have a duty to trust? I used to think that we did. I'm now not sure. I'm not sure trust, I'm probably going to find out in the later session that this is fine, but I'm not sure trust is the kind of thing you can have a duty to have, at least not all forms of trust. And I'm not sure that we as a society have a duty to like maximize people's effectiveness in some ways, only to not limit it unreasonably. And so where we're kind of settled, because it kind of comes out of the resisting distrust thing, is that we maybe have a duty to create what I call like the space for trust. And I think that happens in part by resisting distrust. Right? So I think we ought to reorganize systems of distrust so that they minimize effects. So reduce the burdens of systems, their supervisory elements, any blanket bans that we may face. And now just to link this up, and in the paper, this is much more a part of it. But I also think that this mechanism potentially helps to explain some things that are slightly puzzling about trust, and particularly about some of these attitudes of therapeutic trust or trust responsiveness, the cunning of trust, which are discussed by people like McGeer and Pettit. So in their view, when we're trusted, we seem to, even an untrustworthy person seems to be able to respond to it. And as Caroline said, that seems to be able to happen to children, perhaps, but we do it in other situations. And a lot of the current reasons for that revolve around some sort of, this is the last one, some sort of either further mechanism, hope or esteem are two popular versions, which require you sharing some of the sort of values, I think, and viewpoints that these people offer, or they rely on a kind of responsiveness to dependency, like we saw in the last talk with Jones, which I think also doesn't help explain why this happens in individuals we take to be untrustworthy in the right ways, right? And what I hope is that this mechanism kind of offers a way that we might be able to like conceive of how this sort of trusting someone, even though they're not trustworthy, might start to get a grip on them. It expands the kind of things that they think they're capable of doing, and therefore gives them reason to act in that trusted way. And there's plenty of stuff in the kind of literature on the integration of ex-offenders about the effect that power, responsibility, trust has on kind of desistance, on improving people's chances of not going back to prison. So just to summarize, distrust places psychological limitations on distrusted people. It does this indirectly by increasing their effort, but also directly, I think, by affecting self-belief. And I think this is unjust, except in particularly risky cases. And we ought to try to both dismantle it and offer space for trust in systems that affect distrusted individuals. And that's a quote I won't go through, but thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Do we have any questions? Yes. Start there, and then Carolyn, and then Kristen.
You guys are so good at remembering everyone's names, by the way. It's impressive. Thanks, Matt. I think it's fair for me to ask the first question since my paper was also on a similar
yeah.
topic. I'm curious, so what about, we should, your point at last point there, conclusion, we should work to not, or to avoid distrusting people because it has the effect on distrusted, those who are distrusted, based especially on stereotypes, I think was part of your point, right?
Mhm.
What about folks who might, this is kind of coming back to something, people are probably broken record here, but what about folks who are distrusting a system through which they've experienced injustices? So like what about the offender's distrust of the justice system to actually treat them with fairness and equality? And is that distrust in the same bracket? Could you put it in the same approach that you took, or would it be something completely different?
So yeah, I think that obviously the kind of the feedback effects and the comprehensiveness on your life effects that I described. So all of the effects I described, I think, may be present in one-on-one interactions with people, but they're going to be heightened where there's kind of imbalances and where the social effects are larger, and they're going to be lessened where you're kind of directly, you're more on a level, you're more balanced with each other, right? I don't think we take each other's distrust to do exactly the things that I describe here. And then obviously where you then get those things flipped and your distrust in the organization is going to have very little effect on it or something like that, then I don't think you're likely to see the kind of effects that I'm talking about. And certainly I don't think you would see them to an extent that you had any duty to kind of respond to them, I guess. So it is, yeah, in the paper, perhaps much clearer than I was in that talk, but yeah, this is very much focused on kind of those who are suffering from the system, I guess, in a way. And I don't think much of it applies back the other way. Does that answer? Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. I thought it was a really nice paper. And I think important to discuss how kind of damaging distrust can be. I mean, Miriam talked about how it can be useful and appropriate in some contexts, but when it's pervasive, it really is harmful. I guess I have a little comment and a question. Comment, you talk about how with distrust, you look for evidence of suspicion. I wonder if that's sounds too kind of intentional. So if you have a view of distrust as an emotion, at least on what's called a perceptual view of emotion, it affects what you see in the world. It affects what's salient to you. So that evidence is just salient to you. You're not looking for it. Your perception just directs you to it. So the solution there may be a bit different given right the way it structures your perception if you buy that view of trust, distrust, and emotion. But a question I wondered, so some people argue that distrust is a sign of disrespect. So Jason DeCruz does that. I think Ula Margalit, others have done that. And I just wonder why you didn't bring that up. I think it's kind of implicit in your discussion about belief, self-belief, in a way that, it kind of ultimately what you're saying is I think it diminishes a kind of self-respect. So you end up with self-disrespect in a kind of attributional way anyway, but that could be the result of the fact that actually the distrust itself is a sign of disrespect. I just wondered, I'm sure you're aware of that in the literature, and I wonder why you didn't include that.
So I didn't, thank you very much. I didn't mean to exclude any of those kind of further effects that exist in distrust, right? And I think it's certainly the case that disrespect and the kind of self-attribution that you might make as a result, kind of view that you might come to take of yourself, plays an important role as well in like shaping the agency that's open to you, right? Again, with kind of disrespect, I mean, I think the view faces similar kinds of issues to some of the issues I have with the esteem views, which are quite similar, right? And these various ways that you kind of end up incorporating those into your self-image, which is partially that I think they rely on the fact that you care about whether that person respects you or not, to an extent, right? And I think that distrust can have effects, even if you're you don't care about them to a large degree, right? You might not want respect from the system in some way. You might not think it's the kind of thing from which you need respect. But the aim of this talk was just to kind of try to highlight a specific mechanism that works in conjunction with all of these other things that go on, and limits the kind of agency, limits the kind of things the agent thinks they can do. And I am keen, self-belief, as I'm kind of slightly stipulating it here, I guess. Yeah, that's obviously bound up in your self-interpretation. It's bound, I think, also to, your view on your moral character, your self-perception of that, all of these kind of things. They are not necessarily, I should have been clearer in the talk. I think I am clear in the paper about this, that there's a they are also part of it, but they're kind of, they're not, I don't think, part of your sense of what you can do. They kind of bound the limits of what you think you can do, right? So it's not I think there is a distinction between I cannot do this because of the kind of person that I am, and just I cannot do this, right? And I think pulling them apart is helpful if we're going to try to dismantle all of the different issues that we're facing. Does that go some way? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. I found it convincing, and I just wanted to ask about the connection to self-belief, because I think what you said sounded, as I said, convincing, but I was also wondering, isn't there a value in having kind of correct self-belief, right? So if people constantly trust me to do things that I'm obviously not capable of doing, and so I keep trying and failing, but I might think that, these are just really unfortunate circumstances. I can really do it if I do it one more time. That doesn't seem to really allow me to better lead my life. So I was wondering what you say to that. And I think, so the other two questions are kind of related to that. Then what would be conditions for saying that someone has warranted mistrust? So maybe when should we, signal to someone that we're not trusting you for a good reason, and you should maybe incorporate that into your self-belief, or maybe you resist that there is value. And also related to that, what would you, when does high risk start? So obviously when it's about life, but is it also a high risk if, yes, I'm just leading someone to believe that they can do something. So wasting their lifetime in a project because I'm trusting them to do that, even though it's very clear they cannot do that, and they should rather engage in something else that might be more fulfilling in the long run.
Thank you. I will answer the second one first, I think, and then try to come to the other two, which seem more about the value of trust, right? And so the question of what warranted distrust is, I think in the paper I just tried to be quite general about it and suggest that it's kind of where you think so taking that distrust is something that's meant to protect us from vulnerabilities in some way, right? That it's just a way of taking ourselves away in this way. If there's actual risk involved, kind of from the person, if there's an match between that thing that you're trying to avoid from them and the risk that you're facing, then I take the distrust to be kind of warranted. And I don't want to argue there is a value to interpersonal distrust, potentially, right? I think that you can take steps to protect yourself to distrust in those kind of ways, but I'm less clear that there's ever really a value to kind of social distrust, to kind of this being done on a wider scale. And to answer kind of the other two, part of the reason, so this paper used to be far more trust focused and far more about trust responsiveness and far less about distrust, right? And one of the reasons it's kind of moved is because I'm not entirely sure how to answer those kind of questions that you're asking. So yeah, I think trust can have these kind of effects, right? And I think you do often meet people or you encounter people who have clearly been trusted too much for too long, right? And they have an inflated sense of what they can do quite often for those reasons, right? I'm kind of, my examples are always like British, but I'm kind of thinking of like private school boys in England, right? Often have this kind of attitude. They've always, everywhere they've walked into, they're met with trust. They think they can do all the things, even though they can't. And yeah, I do think that there is a value to correcting for that, being able to calibrate accurately. And I'm not trying to claim, and I hope I didn't claim there, that I think distrust and trust are forms of social feedback about our self-belief, right? But I'm not claiming that they're always good forms of feedback about that, nor that they're the thing that you really need to focus on all the time. And obviously, if you're relying on the fact that you keep getting trusted to do this thing, but you keep actually failing to do it, you ought to be modifying your beliefs to align with that. And yeah, I hadn't really, the high risk question. So as in the trust is linking kind of, yeah. So yeah, I don't think that wasting, so I view that, and I argue in the paper that there needs to be a balance struck. The balance that I tend to think is because you're, in these cases of systematic and pervasive distrust, you're really limiting the kind of life that person can lead, right? And so the bar that I set there is essentially a comparable one. You have to be facing a risk that's at a similar level in the restrictions of the kind of things that you can do, which obviously includes kind of threat of serious physical injury, but might also include kind of aggressive threats, I guess, which might limit what you can do in other ways, or kind of traumatic experiences that you might have. That's the kind of level where I put it.
Two questions. One, so I suppose I'm fundamentally more sympathetic to the idea that you can kind of distrust who you want in most cases. And it seems to me that it's, to some extent, as in some of your concessions in the movement from the individual to the systemic level, you want to permit individuals to distrust a bit more. But then I'm just wondering, in that the systemic is just the aggregate of a series of individual actions, well, how can you kind of have a right to be trusted at a systemic level, but not a right at an individual level? So how do the two translate? How do these relate? And then the second question is whether there's an asymmetry here between where our intuitions might go. So when we're talking about a member of a systemically marginalized group, and we're a member of a privileged group, you think, oh, it's terrible to constantly distrust them. You know, they were participating in the injustice, and everything. Your argument follows really neatly, and it feels right. You know, tickling all the progressive instincts. But if I flip it the other way around, the instincts go the other direction. So the oppressed community has been distrust the privileged community, and maybe that privileged community has cleared itself up, but you still don't want to then accuse the oppressed community of doing the wrong thing. You can say, yeah, of course they distrust them. The privileged community has to earn the trust over time. And I think that applies also in the stereotypes. They're obviously not stereotypes, right? But if I'm an Indigenous Australian, I've got stereotypes about white people, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a wrong against those white people. So I'm not sure that stereotypes, which is a kind of a particular site upon which you might see these asymmetries play out, are as easily as kind of solved as you suggest. So just two thoughts. I really like the paper, so that's my
Thank
question's a
you.
bit confused.
No, that's good. So on the first question on kind of, this distinction between systemic and aggregate, I guess I would push back a little bit on the fact that the systemic is just the aggregate of individual actions, right? You can see that pervasiveness is just the aggregate of individual attitudes. Like how widespread something is just a question of how many people have the thing that is widespread, right? And in those cases, I think where you get pervasive distrust in that way, it's likely to be often stereotypical, though not always, and so unreasonable. And so kind of you should give up that distrust because there's not an actual risk. There's no risk there, so you can just get rid of that. This might be a little bit just of a, and if you do, we can maybe talk about it, but I kind of think that like the issue is going to come where your pervasive distrust within a group starts to form kind of norms or expectations for the way that that group behaves, right? And in that way, it becomes more than simply the aggregate of their individual behaviors. And once you have something systematized in that way, once you have it kind of enculturated like that, I think you can, that's where I'm picturing these points where it could start to come apart a bit, right? And maybe you're justified to do it as an individual, to one individual, so long as that's kind of not contributing to the support of the systems that are unjust, right? So you're kind of balancing those two things. So I guess I would try to pull them, and that is how I try to pull them, so like apart in the paper, right? Systematic is kind of, it's not just simply the add up of all of these different pervasive trusts. And I think it's very unlikely, for example, in the case of ex-offenders, where maybe that is pervasive. And so even if we dismantled all these systems, you're still going to get everyone doing that. But because you get those behavioral patterns in the ways that you're getting them, you're supporting a system which is unjust. And so you get less right to kind of make your individual decisions. So there is a tension that I recognize, but I think I can get around it, hopefully, in those ways. And then on that asymmetry and the clash, yeah, I do agree. I think in part, I think I kind of would go back to an earlier answer that I do think that it matters what the kind of power imbalance is already like, because particularly where you're thinking about, you know, these impacts that I'm claiming it has come through the range of effects that it has on the range of things that you want to do, right? And it may be that an Indigenous community in Australia distrust you in some way, in some set of things, but it's likely that the range of things that you're going to actually need to do that are affected by that distrust are relatively small. Now, if they're important to you and you can't do it for those reasons, I don't think I'd have an issue with kind of buying the bullet on that and going, well, yeah, maybe they are wronging you by thinking in that way, right? But in general, this is largely going to affect groups who are at the kind of, who are oppressed, who are at the bottom of the pile in some ways, because of various things, including the fact that like that, for the start, the actual power will affect the kind of range of options that they can limit. And also because you're going to get more, because of some of the epistemic issues that are explored in kind of the more epistemic justice literature, right? And the effect of how your feedback is going to be taken by various groups and whether their distrust will actually be counted by the dominant group as relevant distrust, right? They're going to respond to that distrust in a kind of different way to the way that a powerful group might have its distrust responded to.
Okay, we have about 3 more minutes. Are there any other questions? No.
Hi, that was great. I wanted to ask, and we can talk about it afterwards as well. Specifically, why maybe you didn't choose to conceptualize the self-belief part as self-trust? Is that something, I don't know if you, is that something you're considered, or because there's like Trudy Govier, for instance, writes about self-trust, self-esteem, and they're so analogous, and maybe it would have helped to crystallize some things more, but maybe you have reasons for not doing that.
I
don't
do
know.
have reasons for not doing self-trust. Yeah. So partially it's because I really wanted to draw out some of this evidence responsiveness that I think this has. I think self-belief helps to do that more clearly. I mean, you can be more specific with your definition of self-trust, right? But it's open to interpretation. It's that kind of that's not going to be necessarily an evidence responsive kind of attitude that you have. I have separate background things. I just don't like the term self-trust very much, because trust seems to me very necessarily social, and I'm not sure how much helpful stuff we do when we like throw that back inside ourselves, right? So there's also just a terminological thing. But yeah, we can get into it more. And like the self-esteem sort of stuff, I'm trying to include all of that in this broader sense of what we can do, but it wasn't what I think this mechanism operates on. So I'm trying to pull out a specific part of that. I think that your self-esteem, your self-confidence, all of these things obviously have a massive role to play. I actually think there's some philosophers who've dealt with self-efficacy. So like Hans Bernhard Schmidt has some stuff on it, a couple of other people, where they're very skeptical that self-belief can exist at all. In the paper, I deal with that, but I don't here. And part of the way that I deal with that is kind of by being like, well, we don't have to have this kind of either or option where like, obviously the emotions play a part, and because of the way that emotions direct the rest of our like minds, right? You're cognitively like, your self-belief is obviously pulled all over the place. And that's actually another of the reasons why we're such bad self-calibrators, right? Because your confidence that you're feeling, the fact that you're depressed on this day, right? You can do exactly the same action. You can do it exactly as successfully, but if you do it on a day where you're feeling bright and optimistic, and you do it on a day where you're feeling depressed and down, you're gonna feel like you did it to a different degree, right? And you're gonna struggle to work out for yourself, unless it's an obvious, like, I don't know, carrying a weight or something, but like any more complicated, you're likely to. So that's partially why I'm not trying to exclude any of those things. And the main reason is that I really wanted to pack in this like evidence responsiveness, which I didn't feel was necessarily apparent. And I also don't like to like go picking terms and then not picking like the whole of like a thing up, which is also why like I'm not talking about self-efficacy, which is what a lot of people do when they talk about this, but like I don't want social psych baggage with me.
Okay, thank you all for your questions. Thank you so much, Matthew. We ran a bit over, but we'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back for more.
And the
Okay, welcome back, everybody. If we could have our panelists come join us at the front.
Oh, they wanted to sit so they can see the screen.
Oh, okay, so we're having a 3-person panel. So we will do 3 presentations, 15 minutes each, and then Q&A at the end. Our first presentation is Dimitrios Panagos from Memorial University with his presentation, Reconciliation and Obligations of Trust.
Well, hello. So this is very much a presentation. It's not, there's no paper. There was a paper, but it died, and now I'm revising it. And so these are my ideas for the revision. So the presentation is called Reconciliation and Obligations of Trust. In this presentation, I'll examine the phenomenon of reconciliation in the context of settler states like Canada, the United States, and Australia. You'll see that I draw mostly on Canadian examples. They're the ones I know best. But I think what I talk about here today are sort of applicable to these other states as well. So my main motivation for the paper in this presentation, or my main motivation for the presentation, is to argue that trust is an important element of future and ongoing processes of reconciliation in these states. So I see basically 3 challenges, or a number of challenges, resulting from the desire to link together trust and reconciliation. First, there's the question of how these 2 phenomena are linked. So one could rightly ask, why is trust important when our concern is reconciliation? Second, I think there's the issue of how to build trust when trust is in short supply. I don't think it's controversial to claim that in states like Canada, there is a significant amount of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who don't trust each other. I think that we could say that there's a trust deficit. And the third challenge is that I think there's an incompatibility between the way that we think and talk about justice and the phenomenon of trust. The dominant framework for justice, which can be characterized as rights-centric, seems ill-equipped to deal with issues like trust. So in this presentation, I'll touch on all of these 3 challenges. Hopefully I'll have enough time. And so I'll tell you now what I come up with. So in terms of the first challenge, I'll make the claim that reconciliation and trust can be linked via the important role played by social cooperation. So in terms of the second challenge, I'll attempt to illustrate how recognition and how the recognition and fulfillment of 2 duties can make a dent in the trust deficits. The first duty that I'll talk about is the duty to reform institutions in a manner that increases rational trust, and I'll explain what I mean by this in the presentation. And the second duty is more akin to what we used to call the virtues. So I'm going to say that, or argue that non-Indigenous people have a duty to work on their trustworthiness in terms of their how they're viewed by Indigenous peoples. In terms of the third challenge, I'll claim that when our concern is reconciliation, it would be more productive, maybe more useful to employ a duty-centric discourse instead of a right-centric discourse, because the former discourse is more compatible with the phenomenon of trust than a right-centric discourse. So I'll start off with a short sort of disclaimer, and I'll just say that not everyone thinks that reconciliation is a good thing. I think this is especially true in some parts of the literature. So you have a number of scholars who are quite critical of reconciliation as a concept. The quote here is by Alfred, who this is his view of one of the things he says about reconciliation. Now, of course, these scholars aren't that's not the only position. There are many scholars who think that reconciliation is just fine, and they think it's really important. I'm not going to settle the settle the debate here and really sort of go into it. But I think that what I'll say is that I think there's good reasons for us to still focus on reconciliation, regardless of what the scholars say or what they're arguing. I think that reconciliation is a really popular concept, and it's kind of sort of captured the popular imaginary. I think about all or the numerous policies and programs and initiatives that are put forward by institutions all across Canada and other countries too, in the name of reconciliation. So people really seem to promote and support reconciliation, and it seems to be something that's very important. There's also big national sort of projects around reconciliation to address really important issues. I'm thinking here of things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established in Canada in 2007. So I think regardless of what's going sort of on in the scholarship, I think on the ground, there's really good reasons for us to be concerned about reconciliation and to think about it and to think about sort of what it is and how we can sort of go forward with it. So again, in terms of a definition of reconciliation, just so we're all on the same page, there is a significant scholarship and that I could turn to sort of give you some definitions of reconciliation. I've sort of decided instead that I'll focus on, well, what do people say who are actually involved in processes of reconciliation? So here I look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, their final sort of report. So I'm looking at basically what people who are involved in this process, how do they understand what they're doing? How do they define reconciliation? And just for those who are not familiar with the TRC, it was set up in 2007 as part of the sort of final or part of the settlement around the legacy of the residential schools in Canada. And the commission gathered testimony from over 6,500 witnesses. The witnesses included residential school survivors, government officials, academics, community groups, organizations, and they issued a report in 2015. So here I have some direct sort of comments or quotes from the people who are involved in this process. So reconciliation is about coming to terms with events of the past in a manner that overcomes conflict and establishes a respectful and healthy relationship among people going forward. There has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harms that have been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. Reconciliation must inspire Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples to transform Canadian society so that our children and grandchildren can live together in peace, dignity, peace, and prosperity on these lands we now share. So a lot of the kind of the descriptions of reconciliation sort of follow that line there. And so I think that there are sort of two central themes to the definition of reconciliation, sort of at the heart of the TRC. One is sort of the significant role of history. So there's kind of this notion that reconciliation needs to outline the ways in which settler state colonialism was unjust and how settler state colonialism still underpins certain injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. So this seems to be a really important part of what a kind of more filled out definition of reconciliation, what it would mean or what it would be. And the second theme is kind of this idea of, or this theme of future connectivity. So reconciliation aims at creating a future where people have the opportunity to connect and pursue common social, economic, and political projects. Now, this isn't a full theory of reconciliation. That would, of course, require a lot more work, but I think it gives us sort of maybe a thin conception, maybe some necessary components to what would be part of a full theory. And hopefully I will have one of those at some point. I think that this, there are really good accounts like Catherine Liu's, which are sort of close to this, but in any case, it's, oh, did I break it? Sorry. Well, maybe I'll just start talking. So the next slide will show, I sort of look at the TRC, the final report to come up with sort of the themes for a definition of reconciliation. And then I look at, okay, well, since the TRC can tell us what reconciliation is, there's also in the TRC a plan or a roadmap for how do we achieve reconciliation. And so this plan is what's referred to as the 94 calls to action Right, so the next one. Right, oh, right. So the where's a chalkboard when you need one? So there is in the TRC at the end, the sort of buildup of this report, which is quite lengthy, is these calls to action. So there's 94 calls to action. These calls to action are really broad in their scope. Each of the calls to action, I only have sort of 3 examples here. Okay. All right, so there's multiple under each of the calls to action. So here I have call to action 10, call to action 50, call to action 92. They're just 3 examples. They're not random, of course, but each of these have also sub call, like sub things, right? Like so it's an enormous sort of really detailed plan of what the TRC kind of puts together as like the way of pursuing reconciliation given residential schools specifically, but also more generally settler state colonialism. And so here, I think if you look at these and the other ones, you'll just take my word for it. In order to achieve any of these or most of these, again, trust me, we need, or we have to, what's assumed or what's required, I should say, is a significant amount of social cooperation. So all of these things require Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, Indigenous and sort of in general, Indigenous, non-Indigenous peoples, authorities, organizations, the Canadian public at large to work together. So none of these things or many of these things require social cooperation. So the basic claim here is that reconciliation in settler states can't happen without social cooperation. And so here's the detailed plan that seems to make this show you this. And so in the literature on social cooperation, you know, there is a discussion or significant discussion about trust. It's an important variable. And so, I mean, there is, of course, contestation about the status of this. And so we sort of talked about it today. For some people, social cooperation isn't possible without trust. For other people, trust is important, but there's other important things, and maybe we don't need trust. I took one group of scholars' position, their sort of characterization of the social cooperation literature, Karen Cook, Margaret Levi, and Russell Hardin, who make the case that the dominant view is the former, and so that's the one I took. It also works out well for my argument, I think. So without knowing the literature as well as well, really at all, that's what I'm going to say. So my link here is between with reconciliation and trust is social cooperation, right? So in order to have social cooperation, which is necessary for reconciliation, we need trust. So what do I mean by trust? The definition of trust that I'm using in the presentation is this idea that trust is defined as an expectation of beneficence. Okay, oh wow, okay. Beneficent reciprocity from others in uncertain or risky situations. Trust reflects a belief that others will act in a way to benefit or at least not harm us before we know the outcome of their behavior. So these, of course, expectations make us vulnerable. This is a conception of trust that seems to have been battered around a lot here in this during this workshop. But that's not really what I'm going to focus on. I don't think. I think what I'm going to focus on is the rational trust. And so what I mean by rational trust is, and I didn't invent this, someone else did, but I haven't written it down here, is you know, the conditions under which it's rational to actually have these expectations. Basically, it's a judgment, and it's a judgment that we can evaluate. And so under some circumstances, it's rational to extend or have these expectations, and others it's not.
So I'm not really focused here on trying to say that we can make somebody trust somebody else, but I think that we can create the conditions that would affect the calculation, that would make the calculation more rational. I think that there's institutions and practices, things that we can do. We can affect sort of like the circumstances for how somebody makes the evaluation. So whether or not they trust is another issue, but we can make it more rational to trust or less rational to trust, or to have these expectations. So that's what I'm focused on here. I got the 2-minute warning, but I don't know if taking into consideration all of the nonsense, that's my fault. Okay, so that's one thing. So that's one way that trust is important. The other thing that I talk about, that I think I want to talk about, is trustworthiness. And so here, I think that, or I talk about sort of trust as a moral phenomenon, so like as a virtue. And so here, the idea is that basically we can think about trustworthiness or trust in sort of as like they used to think about virtues, and focus on specifically indigenous or non-indigenous people. So we can, if we think about trustworthiness as something that has to do with, like having a good character, just like being honest or being brave, we can think of trustworthiness in this way too. And so the focus for the thing that I want to focus on is not general trustworthiness, but specifically indigenous or non-indigenous people's trustworthiness in the eyes of their non-indigenous or their indigenous counterparts. I have this stop. I haven't even gone really through what I was going to suggest. Can I have 2 more minutes? Just a few more minutes. So okay. So now we have this. I won't even use this. That's the enemy. So now we have these sort of like this idea that like, well, trust understood as rational trust and trust understood as trustworthiness. So how do we make it like we want to increase these things? And I think, or I want to argue that like not only is it something that we should do, that we ought to do it as like that should be like a duty. And so I sort of talk about at some point, I talk about like a duty for institutional reform. So I think that like one way to increase, or the way to increase rational trust, is to actually say that people, indigenous and non-indigenous people, have a duty to reform institutions in order to increase rational trust. And so they need to, so this is a requirement. And I had this example that is probably a pretty bad example, and I don't want to do a bad example given the comments about examples today. But there was an example that I was going to talk about, that I can talk about in the question period, that it would actually be helpful for me to sort of work through it, but where I say, okay, look, there's sort of this institutional reform that happened in Hamilton, this sort of new practice that I think facilitates sort of the, or changes the calculus and makes it more rational for people, indigenous and non-indigenous people, to trust one another. And then I talk about this virtue of trustworthiness, which is probably the weakest part of the paper, because I don't really know a lot about the literature on virtue. But from the little that I've read leads me to believe that, aside from sort of what indigenous and non-indigenous people need to do in terms of institutions, there's this other side of like, I'm sorry, just 1 more minute, that like, that the other part of the puzzle is this part about like building their indigenous people, non-indigenous people, thinking about trustworthiness and their trustworthiness is how they're perceived by indigenous people. And so I talk about this duty. And so I say that, look, just like any virtue, you learn trustworthiness by first being educated. So you learn about honesty by having lessons about honesty, and people tell you stories that like where the moral is like, oh, look, it's good to be honest. But then you also learn the virtue by practicing the virtue. And so you do things in light of that education. So for this specific version of this virtue, I think the education has to be about settler state colonialism, about the history. And then you act in a manner that reflects your sort of knowledge of that history. That you center that history when you engage in interactions with indigenous people. So I'll stop there because I don't want to, I know that there's more time the other time. So there you have it. So, yeah, thank you.
Can I just be seated? Thank you. So, I'll do something that I discovered everyone in this room thinks is extremely weird. I have a handout instead of PowerPoint. I'm happy to defend the practice in the, if anyone wants to challenge me on that. But yeah, so there's a handout. So please, I'll start when everyone has one. And yeah, and just as preliminary note, so this is a work in progress extremely, so any and all comments are welcome, and most of the claims are tentative. So this is a talk about democratic theory primarily. Does everyone have a handout at this point? Do enough people have it? I think, yeah, okay, great. So I get started. So this talk is about the role of trust in democracy, which is a topic that's very widely covered in the literature. There's a lot of very good work done on the role of trust in democracy. And things that are usually said about this is that democracy requires various forms of trust. For example, it requires generalized trust to grease the wheels of social cooperation, requires trust in fellow citizens' law-abidingness, second-order trust in democratic institutions, and so on. And I think all of that is correct. However, I also often feel when I read this literature that this is true of any kind of social order, whether democratic or not, right? So in Louis XIV's France, you needed these sorts of trusts to, for society not to collapse. And arguably, if you had epistocracy, so ruled by experts or philosopher kings or whatever, you would still need these sorts of trusts to keep society going. So I think if we want to have some more specific insight about what sort of trust democracy as a specific kind of political practice needs, then we need to say more about what that practice is about. Now, there are lots of different ideas about that out there, obviously. So minimalists think that democracy is about a peaceful transition of power. Realists think that it is about keeping oligarchic power at bay. Epistemic Democrats think it's about communal problem solving and finding the right solutions together to societal problems. And I have my own view as well, which I will just take for granted here. Yeah, so let's just treat it as correct, which it is, but I will not argue for it separately. So my view is that democracy as a political practice is to be understood as ruled by the people. That is hopefully not very controversial. And so if we want to understand what the point of or purpose or raison d'etre of democracy is, then we should think about what the point of rule is. And I think the point of rule is justice. Again, these are all controversial, but in my view, true views that I will not argue for here. So I think the only reason why we would give ruling powers to anyone is for the sake of justice, not just peace or order or something like that. And so the point of democracy as a practice of rule by the people is to rule justly together, right? So there's an instrumental element to it. It is about achieving justice, but it's also kind of a non-instrumental element of it is achieving justice together, because it's a good thing to do this good thing together as partners, as equal partners in this valuable enterprise. Right now, what does that imply for the role of trust in democracy? I think that implies something very interesting, which is that there is a kind of dilemma or paradox or tension or something like that. I'm not sure what to call it. I went for dilemma here, but I'm not sure about that at all. Because on the one hand, ruling together requires trust, because ruling together is a kind of collective activity. It's something that we do together, right? What it means, ruling together, it means co-authoring the system of public rules that govern social cooperation or social interaction in the polities. So it's collective action, right? And it requires trust in each other to engage in that collective venture in good faith, right? So that to understand and be guided by the goals of that institutional purpose. Yeah. So and to say that it requires trust constitutively, that means it's not just that it's instrumentally good. If we all trust each other, it's sort of easier to do this together, or it produces better results, but also that if we don't trust each other to engage in this collective venture in good faith, then we are not really doing this together, right? We are not really co-ruling. We are not ruling together, but rather we are kind of coordinating or being strategic with each other. Right. So ruling justly together requires constitutively this form of trust. However, today's societies are deeply unjust, and not only are they unjust, but the injustices that exist within them tend to systematically benefit certain groups and individuals who therefore have vested interest in upholding those unjust structures and not being guided by, and oftentimes not even understanding the goals of ruling justice together, right? So in these kinds of deeply unjust societies, you have very good reason not to expect many of your fellow citizens to engage in good faith in this kind of collective enterprise for justice, because they have vested interest in upholding injustice. And when you have that, the kind of stance or attitude or disposition that warrants is that of distrust. And here I'm drawing on Mina Krishnamurti's well-known work on this, where she argues precisely that when you have good reason to believe that fellow citizens are geared towards injustice in this sense, then the right thing to do about that is to distrust them rather than trust them. So it seems that we have something like a dilemma sort of thing, which is that if we want to do democracy, we need to rule together, and that requires trust. But if we want to rule together justly, or if we want to achieve justice together, at least together with some people, then we need to distrust a lot of our fellow citizens because they are geared toward injustice in the sense I described above. So ruling justly together requires both trust and distrust, and it seems that that is hard to do, right? It requires both trusting our fellow citizens as conscientious partners in this collective venture of ruling together, but also distrusting them because we know that they have this incentive to be unjust. So how do we resolve this? I want to talk about three possible strategies here that we might rely on. And I'm not entirely satisfied with either of them, and but I do think that all of them have some strengths. So I will be very indecisive about all of this. So the first I call the Goldilocks strategy, where the idea is that, well, trust is a matter of degree. If you say that you trust someone, that doesn't mean that you trust them all the way, or you trust them 100%. You can trust them more or less, and perhaps you can trust them just enough to make this collective venture of democracy work, and not trust them enough so that you don't betray your commitment to justice as a fellow co-ruler of the polity. But I think there are potential problems with this view. First is that there might not be such a kind of sweet spot or Goldilocks zone, because perhaps the amount of trust required to make democracy as a collective venture work is already too much to uphold our commitment to justice simultaneously, right? So if you if you trust all these really awful bad actors in your society to do democracy together, you already kind of betrayed your commitment to trust, commitment to justice. So that there might not be a kind of Goldilocks zone there. And also, as you all know, distrust is not just the lack of trust. Trust and distrust are opposing attitudes. And again, the issue here is that it's not just that, there are some people who you need to trust to do democracy together, and then you may distrust them in other areas of life, as you can trust your doctors as doctor, but you wouldn't trust them as a neighbor or something like that. The issue is that in order to do democracy together with fellow citizens, you need to trust them to be conscientious participants in this collective venture, but also because you know that they have this vested interest, and also because your history tells you that these people are geared towards injustice, you also need to actively distrust them and need to take steps to ensure that they are not going to hinder or impede the quest for justice. And so those seems to be incompatible attitudes that you have to have towards the same person in the same context. So it seems that the problem is much deeper than, oh yeah, we there in some ways we need to trust our fellow citizens, in some other ways we are allowed to distrust them, and we just need to kind of strike a right balance. That the problem seems to be deeper here. Okay, the second possible strategy is what I call the threshold strategy. And I think this is essentially what Robert Lees defends in his book, Sustaining Democracy, where he talks about a similar and in some ways related problem, which he calls the Democrat's Dilemma. The Democrat's Dilemma is about something really similar, which is that as democratic citizens, we want on the one hand to pursue justice, and on the other hand, we need to treat our fellow citizens as political equals. But how can you pursue justice when you treat citizens as political equals who you know or who you strongly believe that are pursuing injustice, right? It seems that treating them as political equals betrays your commitment to justice. Very similar issue here. And essentially his solution is that you introduce a threshold, something like Rawlsian reasonableness, beyond which you're entitled to suspend democracy with them, right? Or to translate it in my kind of framework, to distrust them, to not engage with them as conscientious partners in this democratic enterprise, but rather to treat them as potential obstacles to that and be strategic around that. But if they are within that threshold, right, if the kind of injustices to which they are geared are not so bad, not so egregious, then you're allowed to trust them and treat them as partners in democracy. And that's how you resolve the problem. You only distrust the really very awful people. Potential problems with this is that perhaps the awful people are the majority, right? So it could be that even the lowest plausible threshold is routinely crossed because, just look at the word. People who are committed to injustice tend to be committed to very, very bad forms of injustice all around. A second possible issue here is that we are understandably uncertain about where the threshold exactly should be, and our commitment to justice might dictate to err on the side of justice. And so, so it might still be the case that we should routinely distrust people who are geared towards injustice rather than trust them. And again, here, trust and distrust refer specifically to trust them as kind of conscientious participants in this venture of ruling together justice, not distrust them wholesale, not to think that they are bad people, but to trust them in this kind of institutional capacity, right? Trust them to use their mandate, as Emanuela called it, to use their democratic powers for the sake of justice rather than for the sake of upholding unjust hierarchies, right? So that's the kind of trust and distrust that I'm talking about. It's important to reiterate because I've just used them in a very general sense, but I mean only in the specific sense. Yeah. So in the interest of time, let me just move on to the last strategy, which I call the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it's structurally similar to the Marxist idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is that, look, we know that we have these unjust background conditions that gear people towards injustice. So what we do is we suspend democracy right now. We don't treat them, we don't trust them to wield their democratic powers well and conscientiously and with care and for the sake of justice, but rather we treat them as potential hindrances to justice, be strategic around them, try to defeat them in political warfare in a kind of very realpolitik kind of way. And once we establish reasonably just background conditions where people can be expected to understand and be guided by the values of democracy as ruled by the people, then we start doing democracy together in earnest with them. And I think, again, there are potential problems here, which is that this is likely to be detrimental to both justice and democracy, because creating reasonably just background conditions isn't just a matter of creating some static end state. Justice is something that I think we essentially do together with other peoples, and there is a sense in which imposing it on others in this kind of strategic ways through realpolitik, through political warfare is kind of conceptually misguided. We need to get them on board with this project of justice in order for reasonably just background conditions to be created in the first place. So this is more or less where I am in thinking about this issue. And I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts. One last thing, obviously, one obvious answer could be, well, just give up the framework, right? Give up this conception of democracy and what the practice of democracy is about, and you avoid the whole problem, because if you become a minimalist, you just think that, well, democracy isn't about trust at all. In fact, it's institutionalized mistrust, and it's all about this bargaining and give and take and realpolitik. So just, don't do this. And that's, I don't want to do that, right? I have separate reasons for endorsing this conception of democracy. I kind of anticipate that some of you would have that response, and I appreciate that, but I'm just not going to do that. So thanks very much.
Okay, next we have Mira Bakvarova from University of New Brunswick with her presentation, Trust, Vigilance, and Non-Domination Promoting Institutions.
Okay, is this working? No? Yes? Yeah? Okay. So thanks for staying till the very, very end. It's a long day. And I guess I'm not really presenting a paper. I'm kind of presenting the paper that never was, because I started working on this when we got, well, before we got the grant. Ended up going on like a 6-month compassionate leave from work, and it kind of did not think about this at all. And so I'm now coming back into it, and I'm kind of appealing to your collective wisdom to tell me where it can go from where I'm finding it now, returning back to it. And the idea that I wanted to pursue is that I wanted to say something about mistrust, vigilance, and non-domination. I don't normally work on trust. I mostly kind of blame Dimitri and Kirsten for getting me interested in it. And I kind of wanted to do a workshop with them. So anyway, it's very, so my starting point of interest were arguments about the value of mistrust and the concept of vigilance to democracy, especially as they appear in theories that are centrally concerned with domination and non-domination. So not just very broadly, but like this is where I situated that interest specifically. And the kinds of questions that I was looking to get at are if attitudes of mistrust and vigilance are valuable to democracy, as I think some people successfully argue they are. Does this value extend to integration? So I was trying to connect kind of the concepts of our workshop. If the presence of trust in institutions and trust between groups are indicators of good integration, where does mistrust fit? And does it tell us anything about what good integration looks like? After getting the grant from GoodInt, I've made it my mission to use good integration as often as I can, because that was awesome. And in the original abstract, I was actually hoping to get to an ambitious and fancy argument about political institutions versus institutions that are just delivering public services and goods, and them having different roles in promoting trust. But I have not thought it through that far. So I'm limiting it to
my progress on these initial questions here. And as I said, because I'm kind of thinking about theories that are focused on domination and non-domination, where the problem of domination is a central concern. The starting point of the paper that didn't get to be was going to be an overview of the extent to which a commitment to non-domination necessitates vigilance. This is not a new thought. It's kind of, I don't know, maybe even my resident Greek Plato who said like I don't know, the price of not being interested in politics is being ruled by bad people. So it's an old thought. And I think it's actually all theories, because there's a variety of theories of domination and non-domination, but I think all of them do imply some value and some need for the concept of vigilance or an exercise in vigilance on behalf of citizens. So whatever the particular conception or theory of domination, in general, kind of the features of concepts of domination are that we understand domination to involve asymmetries of political or social power, that power can take many forms, but is in some sense unconstrained, and is morally suspect or unjust, which is why those are the kinds that we are concerned with. And if that is the central concern, then if we think that the chief role of political institutions is to moderate private power and ensure conditions of non-domination between social groups, it is not enough to set up the optimal kind of institutional design and sort of lean back and fall asleep behind the wheel, so to speak. Even if we have rigorous democratic process and checks and balances, public institutions have to be responsive to the shifting dynamics of social power. That's part of the whole point. And not just in like specific policies that they put out, but even in their own, in the configuration of them as well. So like a reconfiguration of institutions in response to something like reconciliation has to be part of that. I think in many sense, it's quite common sense to say that citizens need to pay attention or to have vigilance about institutions, but about relations of power generally, which is not just focused on institutions. And there's like a poetic way that Philip Pettit puts it: institutions cannot walk on their own. They are dead mechanical devices and will gain life and momentum only if they win a place in the habits of people's hearts. It's essentially the thought is that there's only so much that institutional safeguards can affect in combating domination. And the argument that Pettit but others make as well is that we have to rely on safeguards that are less tangible. So like a regime of mutual reliance and civility and trust. But as a counterpart to that, we also have to have vigilance. So if our chief concern is power asymmetries, then there's an implication that citizens need to maintain a level of awareness of social and political power. They have to be able to know, like, we have to be aware that domination is happening and what the structures are. We have to have a feeling about what those structures are that enable it, who the dominators are. It is implicit that the dominators cannot be trusted to dismantle their own dominating positions. And the domination is a problem, even if the dominator is very benevolent. So in the classic example of the master and slave that Philip Pettit gives, even if you are the slave to a master that is hugely benevolent and you completely trust that they have no intention of hurting you, that maybe they're even very interested in your welfare, they're like a huge fan of you, even in principle, it is a problem to have those kinds of positions that exist of a master and slave. So in any case, to the extent that resistance to domination is valuable, then the exercise of vigilance is a precursor or a motivator for resistance is also valuable. And so this kind of then brings us to what is vigilance. Again, I will turn to Pettit is like the Bruce Springsteen of civic Republican theory, if you're not into that kind of vein of thought. Right, so like his concept, right, the way he talked about it, that there is only so much that institutional, I already mentioned that can do for us. So we need the virtue of vigilance, the virtue of remaining alert, especially in dealing with powerful authorities, to the possibility that others may be behaving in a corrupt and sectional fashion. He has an argument that I probably, for the interest of time, will not go over, on the fact that trust and vigilance are compatible. Vigilance is not to be understood as requiring distrust, and he explained explains that by a distinction between having trust in someone and expressing trust in someone. And he does say essentially the idea is that people may feel an attitude of trust because they feel the authorities are uncorrupt and they will reliably behave in the proper manner, but there are good reasons nonetheless why they may go through the expressive motions of distrust, insisting on the necessity of various checks and constraints. It may be that in the absence of such checks and constraints, there is room for arbitrary will on the part of the authorities, and it may be that however uncorrupt the authorities actually are, human corruptibility means that in the absence of the checks and constraints implemented by expressive distrust, they would begin to develop habits of corruption. I don't like the word vigilance itself, but I like the content of the idea. I think the word is a bit, I think of a dad deciding if you can take their daughter to the prom, kind of when I hear the word vigilance. And I don't like mistrust either, but for a different reason, because it sounds to me like in everyday speech, like mistrust almost sounds like you've made a mistake in trusting, but that's not really what is meant by it. So then I was going to look at Patty Leonard's argument that the exercise of vigilance is motivated by an attitude of mistrust. So that would be the attitude that we would need, or that would be valuable to have in order to be the kind of vigilant citizens that is needed. Mistrust here is not understood, as I just said, as like an error in trust, but rather as a constant unwillingness or felt inability to commit to trusting or mistrusting. So it's like a wavering attitude that entails ambivalence towards trustworthiness. And on the political level, it implies a cautious attitude that propels citizens to maintain a watchful eye on the political and social happenings in their community. She accounts for the key differences between mistrust and distrust, to explain how they're conceptually and in practice different. So distrust is relatively stable, whereas mistrust is variable and, very importantly, sensitive to new information. Sometimes we have an attitude of mistrust because it is hard to come to a decision about the trustworthiness of somebody else, not because we are strongly leading either way. So distrust kind of implies a posture of approaching a situation with suspicion and cynicism, whereas mistrust implies to approach it with a questioning mindset or caution. And distrust generally is inimical to democracy, whereas mistrust would be in some ways good. So politically, mistrust in a way depends on trust. Patty Leonard argues that we trust our fellow citizens to monitor for abuses of our own rights and privileges, just as we monitor for abuses of their rights and privileges, as an act of vigilance, even though we are engendering this attitude of mistrust. So then the question was, though, so if we're thinking about the context of integration, or at least if we agree that that trust is good, distrust is bad, some level of, some attitude of mistrust is useful because it underpins vigilance, darn it, then where does mistrust and vigilance fit in the context of integration? And I was at the point where I had started thinking through that answer, and I do not have a very good answer because I've just rejected possible answers. So at first, it seems like mistrust is actually undesirable for integration, even if it's not the same as distrust. To the extent that, this is again, Patty's definition, a group mistrust characterizes relations between groups of people when they are each unsure whether it is best to trust members of the other groups. That just seems like not a very, that seems like a problem in the domain of integration where it might be useful in other aspects for citizenship. At least adopting that kind of posture opens the door towards distrust quite easily. So we might think that it's the only appropriate attitude is trust in the context of integration, not mistrust. Could mistrust be desirable because it's a precursor to distrust that can be, and distrust itself can be contingently valuable for motivating direct political action to fight deep injustice? And I think Joel just discussed that in some way. I thought about Meena Krishnamurthy's well-known argument about the value of distrust. And in her example of the anti-segregationist political action in the South, where she draws on Martin Luther King to extract kind of a theory of distrust as actually valuable, though she explains that it is contingently valuable primarily because it is a motivating force for people to act to overcome a deep injustice when all other methods have failed. But that doesn't seem to me like a good way to go to answer why mistrust and vigilance, like where they, like that seems like a bad answer, basically. It seems like saying that like you have to stay fit because if a bear is after you, you have a better chance of running away, where we want to say like you want to stay fit for your general health and like all these. So it doesn't seem to me like there's a good answer for whether mistrust and vigilance are all good in the context of integration. So then I know then another line of thought, maybe the group mistrust may be in an undesirable posture, but mistrust vis-a-vis institutions, right? So we don't want an attitude of mistrust necessarily even between groups. Can we just say that mistrust is only useful kind of horizontally, right? Not vertically, that it's only an attitude to adopt towards institutions, but not towards fellow citizens. The issue though with domination and non-domination is that domination amongst group is like quite central. So it's hard to decouple that thought from thinking about groups. Then there is another question, another approach that we could find in Leonard. Is mistrust valuable because it would make citizens vigilant about each other's rights? And that could be an important role that the attitude of mistrust and vigilance could play in the context of integration. But the way that that argument works in Leonard, it seems to kind of already presuppose integration. It already presupposes that we have identified that it's not contested who has what rights, that integration, right, or entitlements, right? So it's not contested whether immigrants should have certain kinds of entitlements or rights, that it's not contested if you have ethno-national minorities, exactly like what the relationship is. And it seems to me that that kind of argument only works, like the value of mistrust and vigilance only works there in a way if integration is already taken place. So if you've gotten to a place where individual members of minority groups whether they have distrust towards others or the object of distrust, their experience is not centered around their identity, but it's just part of the general ideological disagreement that democratic societies are characterized by anyway. If you're already there, then kind of mistrust and vigilance could be valuable to illuminate integration in some way. And then I totally steered into the skid of not having an argument by thinking that, so whatever kind of articulation we have of mistrust and vigilance being good civic dispositions, if we're concerned with integration, it would require, we would think that citizens would have to have some really nuanced attitudes, some really complex judgments about integration within their society. And it just seems like the bar becomes really, really high for what is plausible to expect from people. Because most of the time people, to the extent that we try to be vigilant, but most of the time it's kind of flawed and shallow, especially when you are in a climate of polarization, of bad information. It seems like a full-time job to be properly vigilant in the sense that civic Republicans want us to be. And but most people probably most of the time operate on kind of a Bill and Ted level. Sorry, this is only funny if you right, but if you know what I'm referring to, but the level of assessment is like something is off, right? But it's really nuanced, complex judgment may not always be possible. And I had another slide, but I think I'll just leave it, because when I was on the airplane, I realized I have this also in my notes, and I have no idea what the logic was, like how I got to this. And I have no business going anywhere near like empirical things and suggesting what kind of attitudes people should be gauging. But anyway, I had tried to arrive at some idea of like what kind of attitudes would give us a picture of how integration is working that caters to not to like specifically to domination sensitive concerns in the context of integration. But so I will just leave it there. And if there is some clearly obvious answer, please tell me to, like, where mistrust and vigilance, how to connect to integration in a useful way. Okay, I'm not sure how to, okay, here's just, oh, there you go.
So if we wanted to stay on time and leave on time, we have only really about 20 minutes worth of questions. So I guess I'll see how many people really have questions, and then if there's a lot, maybe there might be answers at a later date. I'm seeing a lot already. Okay.
Okay, great, thanks. I have a question to Dimitris about who is bearing the burden in the reconciliation processes. I really like the idea of how you go talking about that. Well, in the reconciliation processes, the burden should be bared by the non-Indigenous peoples. They have a duty to become trustworthy and show that they are trustworthy, and so on and so forth. And I think it's especially important in the light of one of the standard critiques of how some of the Truth and Reconciliation commissions have been working, where the critique is that, well, who bears the burden there? Especially emotional burden is the indigenous peoples who need to go through quite difficult memories connected to themselves and their families and so on and so forth. And the same kind of emotional burden is never borne by the non-indigenous peoples. And I'm sort of wondering whether it is ever possible to reach a situation where in reconciliation, non-indigenous peoples would actually be bearing similar kinds of, or the main burden, especially the emotional burden in the process. Because educating ourselves about indigenous issues or the history, that's not really emotionally burdensome. It's, it sounds like fun and interesting and great. So I'm wondering whether there are ways of having an even burden or ways of the non-indigenous peoples to bear the main burden. And I'm also a little bit worried that if the more we emphasize that the burden should be borne by non-indigenous peoples, and the more we say that, look, now the situation is such that it's on us, what we are doing is the main issue, whether there's a danger that that kind of thought is actually sort of diminishing and marginalizing the experiences of indigenous peoples and saying that, well, look, your emotional burden is not really something that we want to think about anymore.
Okay, my question is also for Dimitris. I was wondering how much work the concept and the context of reconciliation can do for you. And so I was thinking about 2 points. I think the second one you didn't really get to, so maybe you'll you already have it in there. But I was thinking that so in the literature, reconciliation is often understood as like very brief definition as just reestablishing good relations. And then you might not have to get into this, do we need trust for cooperation or not? But it's just very clear that if reconciliation means good relations, trust usually is a part of good relations. Like that is just a very intuitive thing. And the other one was also that I was wondering whether you might want to distinguish between duties of justice and duties associated with reconciliation, because some of the things that you were talking about, even maybe the duty to become trustworthy, you can maybe say that there are rights involved and duties that have to do with justice. And often in reconciliation discourse, one thinks that is one part, right? Like you stop the injustice and you make up for it. And then in order to reconcile, to be in good terms again, you do something else. And that is very clearly not necessarily that you have a right to that, but if you really want to reconcile, this is a duty that you have to fulfill. And in this case, it might overlap completely, right? That the things that you have to do for justice are also exactly those things that you need to reestablish a good relation, but that might help you to explain why we should focus especially on duties here and not just on rights.
I phrase my question as a comment, and I don't have anything for Dimitrios. Zsolt, really quickly, I was just wondering, since you mentioned the deeply unjust way in which our societies are structured, but then it's not just about distrust, but actually that there's a requirement to address these injustices to realize your positive and value-laden conception of democracy in the first place. Because how do we really interact as equals on your basis of democracy if we don't address these injustices? So it's not just that on the one hand we need to trust and on the other hand we need to distrust, but the very functioning of democracy is at stake, right? Because of the injustices which you mentioned. And also that you didn't mention mistrust, because obviously the literature on democratic trust actually suggests that even on your positive conception of democracy, mistrust might play a role. And very briefly on Mira, I was just wondering whether for integration, it's that way that the majority, which is in a position that it might quite easily dominate, obviously trust is the right response initially, a general attitude of trust towards the, let's say, newly immigrated minority. And then on the other hand, for the minority, because they're in a more vulnerable position in terms of the power structures already, then obviously for them vigilance or mistrust might be the right kind of attitude, not take the trust of the majority at face value, and whether you cannot just go in that direction.
Already, I thought it was way down the list. So Dimitri, this is not a field I've paid attention to, and not a mode of analysis that I've paid attention to. So this is really probably outside, it's a strange form of baseball. So as I listen to you, and as I think about the mechanisms which might produce the institutional reasons for to make it rational to be trustworthy, which struck me as the key question you were asking. How can we get there? I'm wondering whether, in fact, an institution which does not require significant trust on the part of the majority population, the court system and the judicial system, is the only way Canada could possibly get there. It's very difficult to think of how we would create a rationale or a reason that it would be rational for the majority to become trustworthy, other than having it forced on them by the courts. Now, my question is, do you see another route to that space?
Oh, great. Quick one for Demetrius. First of all, I was wondering, as you're thinking about ways in which to increase trust, do you have to be constrained to such cognitive sort of creating rational bases for trust rather than using more non-rational mechanisms? So I was thinking back to Gina's talk at the beginning and how she was saying, well, if we just get everyone to participate in things together, then they'll kind of feel like they're a part of a common community, and then they'll trust each other. I was like, well, yeah, that does not seem particularly rational. Sounds like it might be an effective way to get people to trust each other. Is that something that you would exclude from your first limb of how to institutionalize increasing trust between such groups? And yeah, so and then for Zolt, look, I wasn't so convinced on the dilemma, particularly the first limb. I'm not sure how much we have to trust each other in order to have a democracy. Maybe we need to rely upon each other, that not a sufficient number of people will breach the rule of law to tip us into tyranny. But beyond that, I think we can get along with not really thinking that much of each other at all and still have a democracy. You seem to suggest then that's not good enough democracy for you. You want a more perfect democracy. But then I'd say, fine. So ruling justly together imperfectly doesn't require just trust. So long as I'm after imperfect democracy, which is all I think we can get, then your dilemma doesn't hold. It's more, if we were after perfect democracy, we would suffer this dilemma. But then it's a kind of non-ideal, irrelevant question for our own world.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this quick because I have comments for everyone. I'm going to try to do comments for each of the folks. So Dimitri, one thing that occurred to me as I was listening is that I wonder if Tayake's comment about reconciliation isn't as unfriendly as you presented it, right? So if I remember that critique of reconciliation as a process, and thinking here of some things he wrote in the foreword to Paulette Reagan's book on the TRC process. One thing that he said is that actually reconciliation is primarily, in his view, about white Canadians, settler Canadians coming to grips with their own history and reconciling themselves to that history. And if you frame it like that, and what reconciliation is actually kind of very compatible with what you're thinking, right? When we're engaged in a process of reconciliation, we're assuming obligations to educate ourselves and make ourselves trustworthy, whatever that other kind of relationship that we want to create might be, whether we want to go our separate ways, we want to integrate, or however. And I think some of the TRC calls to action that you've listed are actually also about that, right? Creating public spaces for memorialization, and creating new educational systems. And so I wonder if it would be fruitful to think about and frame the paper and the obligations that we have to engage in reconciliation in terms of increasing and creating public spaces for the increase of trustworthiness amongst a community that isn't trustworthy, right? So it still has these features that other folks had mentioned, such as asymmetrical obligations, primarily centered on the perpetrators of the injustice, which I think is something that's emerged in a lot of TRC literature. But it'd be a way of sort of avoiding some of the stuff that rightly you want to avoid, Tayake's criticisms, but maybe enlisting those folks as allies. For Zsolt, I'm very sympathetic to your view of democracy, but I wonder, and this is probably my complaint about Tallis and all philosophers as a political theorist, wither institutions in your account, right? So there's a lot that's loaded into your together, as in, what are we doing when we're ruling together? I think, when I'm looking at your 4 responses, among the Goldilocks one, there might be a Goldilocks A and B, because I think it's one thing to say that there are degrees of trust or distrust, but most democratic theorists in a political science bent will look at systems level or problem-based indicators and say, well, it's not so much about degrees of distrust or trust, it's about locations and sites of trust and distrust, right? And where institutions are the mediating vehicle. And so we need to think harder about when should we distrust and at what moments and areas should we distrust. And so I wonder if there's a 4th possibility sort of lurking there that would maybe make your argument sing. And then Mira, I really liked the thoughts you were sort of stringing together. And I'm wondering if you had ever read any of the work of Pierre Razan-Vallon. So one thing that Pierre Razan-Vallon's thinking about, he's an historian, wrote a beautiful book called Democracy in an Age of Distrust, and then a couple of follow-ups, is what kind of question is vigilance asking? And what more specifically is it asking historically of politicians and institutions? And so he's thinking mostly about the history of France, but he has a couple of ideas. First, people are asking for things like institutions for denunciation, to denounce corruption. People are also often asking for ease of monitoring, what he calls a desire for proximity, so that when I'm thinking about integrating an institution and making mistrust into distrust, I'm also asking for ease of ways to check in, right? And in many ways, as he's pointed out, the desire for proximity is also something that populists and those kind of extra institutional critics are presenting, right? Don't trust those people, I will bring, democracy down to the masses and make it more trustworthy. So I wonder if as you're fleshing out that idea of vigilance, whether that might be just a resource for you, some of that work.
Yeah, thanks. This was a really interesting panel. Really just quick comments for everyone. Is that okay? So Mira, I think you asked some really, really hard questions. So I have no answers. Those are just tougher questions than I could ask. But I wonder about just resurrecting the idea of vigilance and not trusting, right? So the idea, I think what you're questioning is whether trust is such a good for democracy. I think that's really, you can set it up that's what most people think. Let me show you why trust isn't that great for democracy. And then when you have vigilance as a component of non-domination, then you might have the conditions in which it's possible, but you're not requiring it. That sort of that I thought I kept thinking you were going to jump that, make that claim, and maybe there's something wrong with that claim, but that's how I thought that I thought was implicit in some of what, at least some of what you said. For Zolt, I thought, and actually maybe this is your comment too, I thought that the ruling justly together requiring trust was like putting a lot of things packaging together, because ruling together is a idea of self-determination. I mean, why we need to rule together to create justice. I mean, we could have, like, I don't know, some other way to get justice, right? And then, requiring trust, well, maybe it only requires trust because you've just put those two things together. Like, it seemed to me like you might want to unpack, why is self-determination valuable? And it's pretty clear that self-determination could lead to injustice. I mean, that just seems like if people are self-determining, they might make the wrong decision collectively. And then really, then the institutions are just really, so I thought that before you got to level A, I thought it would be helpful to unpack that, because I think you'd get more, well, just because it was packed together. And Dimitri, I mean, these were all great papers, so these are just kind of off my head comments. I did wonder why, I did wonder why trust was needed for social cooperation. I mean, maybe I have a Hobbesian view here, but I think it's possible to have social cooperation under institutional rules that are, because the institutional rules are backed by coercion. That's what Hobbes said. So social cooperation doesn't require trust, I don't think. But it might not be that you have, maybe you mean something else by social cooperation, right? In which it like a better society than a Hobbesian one, but I just thought that was sort of, and I also thought that it just was hard for me to imagine that you would have an obligation to create institutions of conditions of rational trust. I mean, for Indigenous people, it would, I mean, how many years would it take for them to rationally trust the institutions? I think it's possible to have obligations to create just institutions and to have second order obligations for a reparative justice, but to create conditions for rational trust looks like a harder claim. So those are my three thoughts. I don't know if they're any good, but I just thought I'd throw them out, and because feedback's good.
Are there any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much, panelists. Thank you for your talks. They were excellent. I think that's it.
So